Chapter 829. The war against the Tang Empire began with a conspiracy in Qingjing city of the Yan Kingdom, but the real turning point was in Qinghe County. The rebellion of the warlords in Qinghe County led to the destruction of the Tang Navy, and the lake in the Great Swamp was dyed red. After that, the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army invaded the north, and the Southern Army could not help in time. If the disciples of the Academy had not paid a heavy price to defend the Verdant Canyon, the Tang Empire would have been destroyed. This was the first rebellion since the founding of the Tang Empire. According to the news afterward, the scene was extremely bloody and tragic. Therefore, compared to the powerful West Hill Divine Palace and the Golden Palace, the warlords in Qinghe County were the targets of the Tang Army's anger. The warlords in Qinghe County still followed the old rules. In order to gain Li Yu's trust and ensure the suddenness of the rebellion, they left hundreds of their clansmen in Chang and city as hostages. Many of these clansmen were important figures in the warlords. When the news of the rebellion reached Chang'an City, these people naturally became the top priority of the Tang Empire's surveillance. The people in the guild hall had tried to escape and almost succeeded. In the end, they were captured by the ugly prefectural magistrate of Chang'an City, Shangguan Yangyu. From then on, they could not step out of the guild hall. There were two different opinions on how to deal with the descendants of the warlords in Qinghe County. One faction thought that they should be killed as quickly and cruelly as possible. Only then could they intimidate the rebel army in Qinghe County. At the same time, they could offer sacrifices to the spirits of the Tang Navy and hundreds of martyred officials. The other faction thought that if they wanted to intimidate the rebel army in Qinghe County and restrain the warlords, they should control the descendants of the warlords and use them as bargaining chips. With the arrival of the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic corps, especially with the sudden change in the situation, the agreement between the two sides was about to be signed. Whichever faction's opinion was no longer important. The Tang officials could only watch as these people were taken out of the guild hall and sent back to Qinghe County. No matter how unwilling they were, they could only remain silent. At this moment, Ning Ke walked into the Qinghe County guild hall. He was greeted by a middle-aged official. He wore a Tang official uniform but did not wear a crown. He had straight eyes and looked dignified. "Greetings, Mr. 13, the middle-aged official said calmly and politely. Ning Ke said, "Since you don't admit that you are a Tang, why are you still wearing our official uniform?" The middle-aged official's name was Cui Yuan. He was the second son of the old master of the Cui family in Qinghe County. He had been an official in Chang'an for many years. Before the war, he had held a noble position in the Ministry of Rights. Although the Clear River County Guild Hall was under the strictest surveillance, the imperial court didn't deliberately humiliate the descendants of the major clans. They were provided with their daily necessities as usual, but there was no such thing as casual clothes when there were hundreds of people living in the guild hall. That was why Cui Yuan always wore his old official robes. Cui Yuan's smile was somewhat bitter as he said, "I am an official of the Tang Empire. The elders in my clan were foolish and muddle-headed, and dared to have thoughts of betrayal. This has nothing to do with me." Ordinary people might have some considerations because of these words, but not Ning Quebec. He didn't care whether Cui Yuan's current attitude was sincere or not. All he knew was that this person was Old Master Cui's second son and an important character among the clans. He said, "I heard that Old Master Cui has a few beloved grandsons who are also in the guild hall?" Cui Yuan looked at his expression and knew that there was no need to hide anything in front of Mr. 13. He bowed deeply inside saying, "Please calm down, sir." Ning Ke said, "Calming down is like being careful. It is very difficult. Moreover, the Tangs have always thought that Qinghe County belongs to us. The rebellion of the clans is like stabbing us in the back. Do you think that under such circumstances, the people living in this city will still welcome you with a smile?" Cui Yuan's expression was a little ugly as he said, "The clans have been scholars for thousands of years. They have a longer history than Chang'an. Now, they just want to return to thousands of years ago. They really don't dare to call themselves rebels." Ning Ke said, "That makes sense. I know what you are worried about. Otherwise, with the conduct of the clans, even if I am trapped here and an unwelcome guest, I would still have a cup of tea." Cui Yuan said with a bitter smile, "Who doesn't fear death? I'm overly worried, sir. Please forgive me." Ning Ke said, "Even though I cannot calm down, I have to tell you something unwillingly today. The West Hill Divine Palace wants to protect the lives of hundreds of you." When he said this, he had been paying attention to the expression on Cui Yuan's face. He saw that Cui Yuan was still calm after hearing the news, but there was a hint of joy in his eyes. This was exactly what he wanted to see. Cui Yuan bowed deeply to him again and said with a trembling voice, Even though I know how angry you are, I am still very grateful. When I return to Qinghe County, I will definitely restrain my clansmen and be on good terms with the Tang Empire. Ning Ke admired this person's performance. He thought that the clans of Qinghe County were indeed rich. Even a man who was sent to the capital as a hostage could still perform extremely well under such circumstances. He did not reveal any words or aura that might make the Tangs unhappy or angry. He said, "I don't understand the intentions of the West Hill Divine Palace." Cui Yuan thought to himself, how could you not know? You are asking this question just to hear me out. He said bitterly, if we cannot protect Qinghe County, who in the world would dare to trust the Divine Hall? That makes sense. Ning Ke said thoughtfully, the reason is not about the loudness, but the strength of the fist. The Divine Hall's fist is bigger now, so they are more reasonable. Cui Yuan said harmoniously, the academy is only temporarily leading the way. Why are you so modest? I have never liked to be modest. Even in the world, the fist of Haotian Taoism is bigger now. But in Chang'an, the fist of the academy is definitely bigger. So I have decided to be reasonable first. Ning Ke looked at him and said, you said that if we cannot protect Qinghe County, who in the world would dare to trust the Divine Hall? This is very reasonable. So why don't I kill you? Cui Yuan frowned in confusion. If you want to kill us, why do you have to say so much? Ning Ke said, the clans of Qinghe County may really be able to recreate the glory of 1,000 years ago. Unfortunately, you and the people in the guild hall probably won't have the chance to see it. Hearing this, Cui Yuan's expression changed dramatically. He said in a low voice, what do you mean? Could it be that what you said before was false? Does the West Hill Divine Palace not have such a request? The West Hill Divine Palace does want you to live to prove the greatness of Haotian. Ning Ke looked at him and said, the problem is that Qinghe County has killed more than 300 officials of the Tang Empire. More than 1,000 people from the navy to the auxiliary soldiers have died. More than 1,000 people are still doing hard labor in the coal mountain downstream of the Fujian River. Compared to the greatness of Haotian, I think these are more important. Cui Yuan understood what he meant. His body trembled uncontrollably. He shouted angrily, Mr. 13, do you want to ruin the peace talks? Do you not want the Divine Hall to sign the peace treaty? Under the rule of the Tang Empire, the clans of Qinghe County have not been dogs for a whole 1,000 years. It has been too long. You seem to have forgotten what dogs do. You have forgotten the consciousness of being dogs. Ning Ke said, you do have to look at the owner before you beat the dog. The owner will definitely want to protect his own dog. But if I really kill all of you, what can your owner do? At most, I will pay some money. Do you expect me to pay with my life? The life of a dog is cheap after all. It will never be as valuable as a human life. Since the day Qinghe County rebelled, you have become the dogs of the West Hill Divine Palace. Your life is worthless. Cui Yuan stared at him and shouted sternly, if you want to kill us, just come. We have been waiting in the guild hall for so many days. We never thought that we would be able to leave alive. Even those children are prepared to die. Why do you have to humiliate us with those words? Is this how the Tangs do things? I know that you are prepared to die. I told you the Divine Hall's request earlier not to humiliate you, but to hope that you can have hope again. Hope is so beautiful. The despair that follows is so painful, just like the soldiers who died in the hands of the clans. Ning Ke said, this is indeed not the style of the Tang army and people. But I have always been an atypical Tang. In order to return pain to my enemies, I can do many things. I will be very patient. You will be the first to experience it, but you will not be the last. Cui Yuan's face was extremely pale. When he heard that the West Hill Divine Palace had asked the Tang Empire to send hundreds of his clansmen back to Qinghe County, there was a flash of joy in his eyes. But that joy had long disappeared. He could not see any hope. There was no calmness left, only despair. I vaguely heard some suppressed cheers earlier. I think our conversation must have spread throughout the guild hall. Thinking that those cheers will soon turn into cries of pain, I feel happy both physically and mentally. After saying this, Ning Ke pulled out his padao and moved forward. With a soft sound, the sharp and heavy blade slowly pierced through Cui Yuan's abdomen. Ning Ke began to pull out the knife. His movements were very slow and gentle, so Cui Yuan was in great pain. Cui Yuan covered his bleeding abdomen and slowly sat down on a chair. His face was pale and his chest was heaving. He seemed to be in great pain, but he could not die immediately. Ning Ke carried his knife and walked to the entrance of the Qinghe County Guild Hall. The disciples of the Yulin Royal Guards and the Fish Dragon Gang's Hall of Discipline had already surrounded the Qinghe County Guild Hall. Ning Ke ordered, Kill those wearing the Tang Empire's official robes slowly. Also, don't forget to take off your robes when you collect the corpses. Kill those under 14 years of age quickly. Yes, sir. The Yulin Royal Guards and the Fish Dragon Gang responded in unison and walked past him with murderous intent. In the guild hall, a young man from Qinghe County ran down the stairs and hugged Cui Yuan's dying body in the chair. Tears streamed down his face as he cried, "Father?" A man from the Fish Dragon Gang chopped him down in a pool of blood. The massacre in the Qinghe County Guild Hall had officially begun. There were dead people everywhere and blood was flowing everywhere. The sound of the blade cutting into flesh and the miserable cries drifted far away along with the spring rain. Ning Kai carried his padao and stood at the threshold of the Qinghe County Guild Hall, watching the lingering spring rain. The rain on his clothes had already dried, but there was a lot of fresh blood on them. Whether it was the Yulin Royal Guards or the Fish Dragon Gang, they were hesitant to kill some special targets. Ning Kai did not give them time to hesitate and chose to let his iron knife be stained with blood. He did not wipe the blood because it would probably not be clean no matter how hard he tried. Continue writing. Try to update the second chapter before 12:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 8:30. Ning Kai returned to the house by the Yanming Lake. His clothes were stained with blood, which had been drenched by the spring rain. At this time, it had been diluted and looked like a watercolor painting. Many people were waiting for his return, waiting for him to sign his name and complete the agreement. The ministers of the Tang Empire, the head of the Revelation Institute of the West Hill Divine Palace, and the important figures in the diplomatic mission were all relieved to see him enter the house. Ning Kai took the towel from the maidservant and wiped the rain off his face. He walked to the table and read the detailed clauses in the agreement. Without any hesitation, he picked up the brush and prepared to sign. The head of the Revelation Institute looked at the blood on his clothes and suddenly had a bad feeling. He said in a low voice, "Wait, where did Mr. 13 go?" Before Ning Kai could answer, someone came to the Yanming Lake in the rain and told everyone in the room about the bloody incident in the Guild Hall of Qinghe County. The hall suddenly became quiet. The members of the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic mission looked terrible. Lu Yiqing lowered his head and held the hilt of his sword tightly. Xie Qingyun looked at Ning Kai in shock. He could not imagine that his former classmate could be so cold-blooded. The officials of the Tang Empire were also shocked, but their emotions were completely different from the West Hill Divine Palace. Zheng Jing, the Grand Secretary, looked at Ning Kai and nodded slightly in approval. General Xu Cheng, who had been sitting silently in the corner, slammed the table hard and shouted, "Good job! The bloody incident in the Qinghe County Guild Hall was done by Mr. 13? The head of the Revelation Institute stared into Ning Kai's eyes and asked coldly. Ning Kai said, "Do I need to report to you? So you admit it?" The head of the Revelation Institute had a terrible look on his face. He shouted, "If that's the case, do you still want to sign this agreement?" Ning Kai did not care, even though he was the head of the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic mission. He threw the brush back into the inkstone and walked to the back garden. He took a cold shower and asked the maidservant to make a pot of hot tea. Then he went directly to the plum garden. Yi Hongyu slowly stood up in the rain corridor and looked at him. She said, "Why are there more problems?" Ning Kai walked to her side and poured 2 cups of hot tea from the pot. He took 1 cup and held it in his hand to warm his palms that had been washed by the rain. Then he lay down on the bamboo chair. He said, "The Tang Empire has always been very faithful to its promises. Once it's signed, it's not easy to take action. So, of course, I have to kill those people I want to kill before I sign." Yi Hongyu stared into his eyes and said, "You promised that I wouldn't touch them." Ning Kai pushed the teacup to her and said, "I promised you that I would send back the descendants of the clans in the Clear River Guild Hall. I didn't say that I would definitely send them back alive. Their corpses are all outside the courtyard. If the Divine Hall is interested, they can bring them back to Clear River at any time. I have no interest in collecting their corpses." Yi Hongyu said, "Do you think this is interesting?" Ning Kai said, "Of course it's interesting. Otherwise why would I do it? Even if you think word games are boring, you have to understand that I haven't signed that piece of paper so I can do anything." Yi Hongyu said, "Aren't you worried that you will anger me? Anger can't decide the outcome. Just like how you have angered me long ago, I can't kill you because I can't control the situation. Similarly, you can't decide everything. Regardless of whether it's the hierarch or the person hiding behind the scenes, they all need you to bring the agreement back to the Divine Hall. So your anger can't affect anything. Ning Ke took a sip of tea and said, "Moreover, we have already given you what you want the most. Those people in the Clear River Guild Hall are just accessories and not important at all." Yi Hongyu said, "It's not up to you to decide whether it's important or not. The clans in Qinghe County are just a group of dogs raised by the Divine Hall. You might be angry that these dogs have been killed, but you won't go so far as to fall out with the Academy just because of this. On the contrary, don't you think that it's not a bad thing for the Divine Hall to let me vent my anger?" Ning Ke smiled and said, "Also, I might not be able to decide whether this matter is important to you. So, I did it first before telling you. This is helping you make the decision." The spring rain was pattering in front of the eaves and the sky was a little dark. The robe of judgment on Yi Hongyu's body was like a blood flag, but it could not cover up the smell of blood coming from Ning Quebec. He had already taken a bath, but the smell of blood was still strong. He really didn't know how many people he had killed in the Clear River Guild Hall. No matter how much bitter tea he drank, it would be difficult to cleanse his heart. It was quiet in the corridor for a long time. Yi Hongyu said, "It's all over." Ning Ke said, "Or it's just the beginning?" Yi Hongyu looked at him and asked, "Will you still kill people like today in the future?" Ning Ke thought for a moment and said, "I do have many people I want to kill." Yi Hongyu raised her eyebrows slightly and said, "Your name will be on the agreement." Ning Ke smiled and said, "You know how shameless I can be." Yi Hongyu said, "Even in the name of the Academy? I have never cared about my teacher's reputation." Ning Ke put down the teacup and stood up to stretch. He was saying goodbye, not to the West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic corps, but to Mo Shanshan. Mo Shanshan said, "Then I should go." Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, "Actually, it's good to leave a few days later." Mo Shanshan said calmly, "No matter how late you are, you will have to leave eventually." Ning Ke did not know what to say so he did not answer. Mo Shanshan looked at him and asked seriously, "Will you kill a lot of people in the future?" Ning Ke thought for a moment and said, "Yes, if I can leave Chang'an, I will kill a lot of people." Mo Shanshan looked at her white shoes and did not speak for a long time. No one knew what she was thinking. Then she looked up and said with a sweet smile, "I wish you a happy killing." Ning Ke felt that the spring rain became softer and said, "I will try my best." The West Hill Divine Palace's diplomatic corps left and the war officially came to an end. Although the Golden Palace who occupied the Xiangwan Plain tried to move south in late spring, they were fiercely counterattacked by the Northern Battlefront Army and were severely reprimanded by the West Hill Divine Palace. They had to retreat to the 7 stockade villages and accept the reality. The war gradually subsided. The Eastern Wilderness Cavalry fled back to the Yen territory, and most of the Divine Hall Coalition Army also retreated to the South Jin Kingdom and the West Hill Divine Kingdom. Life gradually became peaceful, but many people had died. The white banners in front of the prince's mansion did not completely vent the anger of the Tangs. The imperial court did a lot of work for this, hoping to direct the anger to the right target such as Haoyan Taoism. Ning Ke did not care about these things. In peacetime, the back of the mountain of the academy still followed the law of not interfering with the imperial court. The most important thing was that he was not in the mood to care about these things. He wanted to leave the city. He had not left Chang'an for many days. Many people wanted to enter Chang'an, but they could not because he was in the city. He wanted to leave the city but he did not dare to. Because in a small town outside the city, someone was drinking and eating meat. Ning Ke found that he had become a prisoner in this city just as Yi Hongyu said. He still had many unsolved mysteries in his heart. Who found the drunkard and let him come to Chang'an? Why did that person return the carriage and iron arrows to him? Why did that person let the drunkard tell him that? Every death in the world is a reunion after a long separation. What did that mean? He had thought of a possibility, but his reason told him that it was the least possible. Therefore he was trapped in the city. I will try to finish the 3rd chapter before 3:30. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 831. Every death in the world is a reunion after a long separation. This sentence was obscure and artistic. It was not like the spring breeze at this time, but more like the spring breeze with sand and lust that would blow in Chang'an for a few days in late spring. Ning Ke thought about it for a long time but did not understand what it meant. He did not even have a clue, so he became more and more worried. Not being able to leave Chang'an was his biggest worry. The city was his city of worries. He was trapped in the city of worries, so he sat on the high city wall and stared blankly every day. The Empress came and walked to his side. She gently rubbed his head and said tenderly, You still don't understand the meaning of that sentence? According to the seniority in the academy, the Empress should call Ning Ke youngest uncle. But she was older than Ning Ke and was considered an elder in the eyes of His Majesty. Especially since last autumn she and Ning Ke returned to Chang'an from the wilderness. They had gone through thick and thin together and trusted each other, so she naturally did this. Ning Ke shook his head gently. He did not understand the sentence. The Empress and his senior brothers and sisters at the back of the mountain of the academy also did not understand the profound meaning of the drunkard's words. They analyzed for a long time and found that there was a similar description in the West Hill scripture. The death of all lives in the world was not the end, but the return to the glory of Hao Yan's divine kingdom. The problem was that the only person who was qualified to say this was Hao Yan herself. The Empress looked at him and asked, "Do you still think it's not her?" Ning Ke said, "Sang Sang is dead." The Empress asked, "Why are you so sure?" Ning Ke looked at the thread-like streets below and searched for the location of the old brush pen shop. He said, "She is my natal life. If she is still alive I would definitely know." The Empress walked to the city wall and said slowly, "Many people have died, but the problem is still not solved." Ning Ke did not care about the undercurrents in the court, but he knew what she meant. Although no one dares to say it publicly, there are still many people who find it hard to accept that I, the Holy Virgin of the Devil's sect, will be in charge of the Tang Empire. At the very least they are very resistant to it. This is not a good thing. The agreement with the West Hill Divine Palace is still a thorn in the hearts of the Tangs. Li Peiyan's death can only alleviate it but not completely solve it. Because all the Tangs know that I am the one who keeps my word in the palace. The Li family has ruled the Tang Empire for thousands of years and has been supported by the people for thousands of years. As a member of the royal family I should die for the people. I'm the daughter-in-law of the Li family and I'm willing to do something. You were right that day in the hall. Li Huiyuan is dead and Li Yu only has her brother left. I believe she will know what to do. The Empress looked at the city she had lived in for many years and spoke with a smile. Ning Ke's heart sank with every word she said. Before she could finish he said, "Please wake up, Her Highness. Don't think about those unreasonable things." The Empress gradually stopped smiling. She looked through the clouds outside the city wall and looked at the looming palace in the distance. She said calmly, "I didn't intend to reason with you, Mr. 13. Ning Ke stared at her hands on the city wall and asked, "Why?" "Because I'm tired. I'm really tired now." The Empress frowned slightly, looking indescribably delicate and lovely. In fact, her face was not very beautiful, but just a slight change in her expression made her look beautiful. It was only at this moment that people would remember that she was the legendary saintess of the Devil's Doctrine who was the best at manipulating people's hearts. Many years ago, I was just a very ordinary girl by the Daming Lake. I don't know why the elders in the sect chose me as the saintess and ordered me to go south to seduce the crown prince of the Tang Empire, waiting for the chaos. She said, "At that time, I thought he was a fatuous and lustful person, so I was naturally unwilling. Besides, I didn't think I was good at seducing men, so I decided to kill him." Ning Ke asked, "Your Majesty suffered a hidden injury at that time?" The Empress said, "Yes, but I didn't kill him at that time, so I thought I had failed. I didn't expect that he didn't blame me and even hid many truths for me." Ning Ke was silent. Although he knew that His Majesty was a person who valued relationships, he still couldn't understand why he would make such a choice back then. Only then did I realize that he had truly fallen in love with me. Thus, I began to reject him while welcoming him. I used all the skills that I learned in the Enlightenment doctrine, or rather, the skills that I was born with, on him until he could no longer leave me and even decided to welcome me into the palace. The Empress smiled and said, "At that time I thought I had won, but I didn't expect that I would lose in the end. Because I spent too much time on him, I unknowingly fell in love with him. Just like how he couldn't leave me, I couldn't leave him either. His Majesty is one of the two men who love me the most in this world. I helped him deal with state affairs for a period of time. Rumor has it that he didn't let me continue to deal with it because of some gossip. Only I know that it was because he was worried that I would overwork myself. I have the ability to deal with state affairs, but I really don't like it. I just like talking and laughing with him, playing with him, throwing a little tantrum and making some food. That's all." He left. Because of the injury that I planted in him many years ago, I had to hold on and stay calm until I returned to Chang'an from the wilderness until I settled his affairs. I think I handled it well. When I see His Majesty, I believe that he will be satisfied. Then what reason do I have to stay here? I don't want him to wait for me for too long." It was quiet on the city wall. Ning Ke's gaze still fell on the Empress's hand on the city wall. He felt very complicated at this time. He was shocked and confused, but he couldn't find the right words to describe it. He said in a slightly hoarse voice, "Don't you think that's very selfish?" The Empress smiled and said, "I am the siren of the devil's doctrine in the eyes of the world. It's natural for me to be selfish." Ning Ke said, "The prince is still young. He still needs you as his mother to raise him. My son has Mr. First as his teacher. What else do I need to worry about? I have already made arrangements. Su Qi and Zheng Jing have written me letters. The situation is difficult but stable. The court has its own rules. It doesn't matter whether I am there or not. It's actually good for the Tang Empire if I am not there. At least those Haotian Taoism charlatans can no longer use my background to talk about things." The smile on her face seemed to be shining and extremely proud. Ning Ke said, "I won't allow this to happen." The Empress smiled and said, "I remember someone once said that there are only two things in this world that no one can control. Even Haotian can't control, and that is life and death." Ning Ke still wanted to say something. The Empress looked at him and said calmly, "I have said before that there are two men in the world who love me the most. In addition to His Majesty, the other one is my brother Xiao. And he happened to die in your hands." Ning Ke did not say anything. "How you felt when Sang Sang died was how I felt when His Majesty closed his eyes. At that time, I jumped down from Helan City because I was forced by the situation. Now that I think about it, maybe I already had the will to die at that time. But Helan City is still a little short." The Empress looked at the clouds below the city wall and said with a smile, "I think Chang and City should be tall enough." She was smiling, but the expression on her face was as indifferent as the clouds and smoke, as if she was no longer in this world. Then she left the city wall and fell into the clouds. Ning Ke had countless ways to catch her or pull her back, but he did not do anything because his body was very stiff and because he saw her face when she left. Her skirt was swaying like a flower. She closed her eyes and the expression on her face was so peaceful, as if she was about to enter the best world, which made people feel extremely comforted and at ease. Not many people had the heart to break that kind of peace. Ning Ke stood on the city wall and looked at the flowing clouds for a long time. Then he left. Many people came and went in his life and they never came back. And they left so suddenly or decisively, which made him feel lost and sad. His family and friends in the general's mansion, the headmaster and Sang Sang, His Majesty and the Empress were all like that. There was a great fear between life and death. Ning Ke had lived two lives and was used to seeing life and death in the wilderness of Min Mountain. But he had never understood the great fear that even eminent monks and Vedanta could not see through. On the night that Hua Shangyue wanted to save Liu from Chang'an, he once said to Cao Shaoshu that such an idiotic behavior was really hard to understand. That was because he had never understood love. What is love in the world? It makes people live and die for it. Ning Ke always remembered this sentence. He always felt that this sentence was too literary and pedantic and he did not like it. Just like that sentence, every death in the world is a reunion after a long separation. It was not until this moment that he finally understood a little. After Ning Ke walked down the city wall, he went directly to the princess mansion. He lifted the layers of gauze on the balcony, looked at Liu and said directly, "The Empress has passed away." Liu was telling a story to Xiaoman. Ning Ke looked carefully and found that it was the story that he had told her before. Hearing this, she did not react. After a long time, she slowly raised her head, and her pale face was full of confusion. "Why? If I say that it is for love, I don't know if you will believe me." Ning Ke looked at her and said, "Get ready to enter the palace. I will send Xiaoman to the academy to study." In the blink of an eye, it was late spring in Chang'an, but it was still rainy. The people had not completely gotten rid of the sorrow of the Empress' death. The soldiers waiting on the Vermilion Bird Avenue still had white cloth wrapped around their arms. The Yulin royal guards solemnly lined up in front of the palace. Solemn and elegant music resounded in the palace. The civil and military officials of the imperial court, dressed in court clothes, filed in under the guidance of eunuchs. The bell gradually rang. On this day, the new emperor of the Tang Empire officially ascended the throne. There is one more chapter, the last plot of this volume. There should not be too many words. I continue to write. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 832. It rained heavily during the Qingming festival. As time went by, Chang'an City really calmed down. Those who had passed away were not forgotten, but kept in the depths of their hearts. In the seemingly lively and joyful streets, there was an invisible force quietly accumulating, ready to burst out at any time. The officials in the court were fiercely debating about political affairs. Some military generals were impatient and came forward to propose a new plan, which led to a new round of debate. Shangguan Yangyu, who had been promoted from prefectural magistrate of Chang and city to grand secretary of the Hall of Illustrious Persons a month ago, squinted his wretched triangular eyes and stroked his sparse goatee, fighting with the officials of the Ministry of Revenue again. A childish boy sat on the throne, listening to the officials debate. Obviously there were many things he did not understand, but his expression was focused and calm. Only his bright yellow robe, which was wrinkled by his two small hands, showed his nervousness and confusion. The newly ascended emperor would probably still be a playful child in the eyes of the common people. Being able to have such a steady performance already made the officials in the court very satisfied. Every time they thought of this, their gazes towards the wheelchair at the side of the throne became even more respectful. The wheelchair was very ordinary. It was a little dazzling in the solemn and magnificent hall of the palace. But because of the scholar sitting in the wheelchair, it was no longer dazzling. The scholar wore an old cotton-padded jacket and held an old book in his hand. He did not listen to the discussion in the court, but just quietly read as usual. However, many people in the hall had been paying attention to him. Even if the scholar was tired from reading and frowned, it would cause a lot of speculation. The little emperor was the same. He could sit on the throne, endure the boring government affairs, and at least appear focused and calm because his teacher was beside him. The scholar was his teacher, the eldest brother of the academy. After the court meeting, the relevant memorials and files were not sent to the imperial study, but to a side hall in the depths of the palace. The little emperor also came at the same time. Liu lived in this side hall. With the death of the empress, there were no more disputes between the two factions. All the officials put their energy into government affairs and war preparations. The academy had no interest or ability in dealing with state affairs. As the royal sister, she was naturally the most suitable candidate. Now every day she had to read memorials and read files. Most importantly, she had to teach His Majesty how to deal with government affairs. The Empress was right before she passed away. She only had this one younger brother now. The academy did not restrict her movements, but for some reason, Liu rarely left her palace after she moved into the palace. As for the courtiers who were loyal to her, she had never seen them before. The spring rain fell in the imperial palace. After the officials walked out of the main hall, some of them could not help but look into the depths of the imperial palace, revealing a sorrowful expression. Most of them nodded to the imperial study not far away before leaving the imperial palace. After a long time, the door of the imperial study slowly opened. Ning Ke washed his hands in the copper basin carried by a palace maid and thanked her. He picked up the umbrella by the door and walked into the spring rain. At this time the spring rain was no longer cold. It was just a lingering feeling. Moreover, the rain was so light that there was no need to hold an umbrella. Walking on the wet street was a special feeling. Ning Ke could not leave the city now, so he was used to walking around the city. He went to the old brush pen shop and found that the wall had been repaired, but the old cat was nowhere to be found. Then he returned to the house by the Yanming Lake and looked at the thin willows and dewy lotus leaves by the lake. He was silent for a long time as usual. Eldest brother was in the palace, second brother was guarding the academy, and third sister had left. Master Huang Yang had not recovered after being seriously injured by the Abbey Dean. He left Chang the day before yesterday and said that he wanted to go to the Shenkong temple again. But this time he was not going to study Buddhism, but to ask the disciples of the Buddhism sect to solve some doubts in his heart. Many people had died or left, but there were always people who missed or were sentimentally attached to them. However, as Ning Ke had once thought, not many people remembered Sang Sang except for the cat in the old brush pen shop and the lotus in the Yanming Lake. The yellow-haired Sang Sang, the black-haired Sang Sang, the diligent Sang Sang, the Sang Sang that could be hugged in summer, and the ugly Sang Sang were all easily forgotten. She was too inconspicuous. Whether she was the daughter of Yama, the successor of Light, or the incarnation of Haotian, she disappeared just like that. The maidservant brought a letter. Ning Ke tore open the envelope and found that it was a return receipt from the letter office. There was a banknote that had been returned to him. He looked at the banknote and thought of many things. He closed his eyes and thought of many things again. He increasingly felt that he was really like a prisoner in Chang'an, and it became difficult for him to breathe. He thought for a long time and finally walked out of the courtyard. He looked at the driver in front of the black horse carriage and said, "It seems a bit wrong to ask you to be my driver." The driver was Wang Jinglu. After General Su Shi died in battle, he rushed back to Chang'an to report the news, and then stayed in the military ministry. For some reason he had become Ning Kei's driver now. Wang Jinglu said indifferently, "As long as you can fulfill your promise, I will do anything." Ning Kei said, "Definitely." Wang Jinglu asked, "Where are we going?" Ning Kei said, "The South City Gate." The black horse carriage moved silently on the streets in the spring rain. Not long after, it arrived at the South City Gate. The horse carriage stopped at the city gate for a long time. The rain on the walls of the carriage gradually dried, but there was still no movement. No one knew whether the people in the carriage wanted to enter or leave the city. The soldiers of the city gate department and the surrounding stalls all recognized the black horse carriage. This was because the horse carriage often stopped at the city gate for a long time in recent days. Many people's eyes fell on the black horse carriage, wanting to see if it would leave the city today. Time passed slowly. Wang Jinglu said, "There are actually many places to visit in the city." Ning Kei did not speak in the carriage. He held the letter tightly in his hand, but it was as if he had seen the Empress jump in front of his eyes. He once again experienced that feeling. "Let's go," he said. Wang Jinglu lifted the reins and was ready to turn the horse carriage around. He asked, "Where to?" Ning Kei said, "Out of the city." Wang Jinglu's hand that was holding the reins slightly stiffened. He said, "Are you sure?" Ning Kei said, "If I don't even dare to go 10 miles out of the city, how can I kill people from 10,000 miles away in the future?" 10 miles south of Chang'an, there was a pavilion. There were large patches of weeds and many graves. Ning Kei first went to the joint grave of His Majesty and the Empress, and then to the cemetery of the military ministry, where many soldiers who had died in battle were buried. Then he pushed aside the weeds and came to the graves of Yan Sei and Wei Guangming. When you left, you should have seen a lot of the future. But why do people always have to die to see it? What meaning does it have to the people who are still alive? After saying this, he walked to the left and came to the newly built grave. This stone grave was very small, just as small as Sang Sang. Because there were only a few maidservant clothes, half a box of notes, and 2 boxes of cosmetics from Chenjinji Cosmetics store. Zheng Jing and his wife stood in front of the grave, supporting each other. Mrs. Zheng's eyes were very red and swollen. It seemed that she had been crying in front of the grave for a long time. The servants of the Grand Secretary's mansion were cleaning up the incense and candles around. Ning Kei came forward and said respectfully, "Father-in-law, you should take my mother-in-law back first." Grand Secretary Zheng Jing did not expect to see him outside the city. He was shocked at first, but then he understood the reason. He suddenly burst into tears and patted Ning Kei's shoulder with relief. The people of the Grand Secretary's mansion had returned to the city. Ning Kei stood alone in front of Sang Sang's grave. He took out the letter from his bosom and tore the note in half. One half was burned in front of the grave along with the receipt, and the other half was carefully put back into his bosom. Then he left. The black horse carriage approached Chang'an. He sat in the carriage and listened to the spring rain knocking on the window in silence. Suddenly the wind came from the north. In this late spring wind, too much yellow soil in the north became yellow mud after being drenched by the rain. The rain was getting heavier and heavier, dripping down from the city walls to the ground like a yellow curtain falling over the city. He thought of the mud wall in the city of Wei. That note was sent to the city of Wei. Sang Sang had been sending notes to the city of Wei every month since she came to Chang'an. But this receipt said, "No such person found." Yes, there was no one in the city of Wei. Sang Sang was also gone. Ning Kei cried bitterly. He jumped off the horse carriage and walked into the rain. The rain fell on his face and mixed with his tears. The black horse carriage followed behind him. A passerby who was hurrying to avoid the rain saw this strange scene and asked confusedly, "Why don't you take the carriage? It's not the right time to enjoy the rain. It's so dirty." Ning Kei wiped the water off his face and pointed at the willow tree by the state highway that was still green even though it was hit by the muddy rain. He said, "But it's spring, isn't it?" The end of the 4th volume, to be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian. Come to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 833. Jiang Yi had already written 4 volumes. The first volume was about the empire in the morning, the second was about the lake in winter, the third was about the troubled times, and the fourth was about the year of the curtain. I liked the titles of these volumes very much, because the titles and the contents of each volume could be harmoniously combined. For example, the 3 cold lakes in the 2nd volume, the 2 autumns in the 3rd volume, and the curtain falling several times in the 4th volume, the curtain falling on people or the city. At the end of the volume, I was used to chatting with everyone, reviewing or explaining. But most of the time I just wanted to chat. The first thing I wanted to say was that I liked the fourth volume very much, even more than the second. I said a few days ago that I wanted to finish the content of this volume in a few days, and then I extended it a lot. It was not because I was reluctant to finish it, nor was it because I wanted to write more. It was because I thought about it carefully and moved the content of the next volume, which was mainly about the peace talks, to the fourth volume. Because I wanted this volume to end on the yellow sand, spring rain and Qingming festival. Jiang Yi had been preparing to write 7 volumes since the year before last, because he wanted to compare the 7 volumes of the Tomes of Arcane in the Jishou Abbey. Now, because the plot was moved forward, and because I suddenly realized why I had to follow the Haoyan Taoism, I decided to follow the path of the Academy's 6 arts or 6 classics. The book was divided into 6 volumes. There were too many things I was satisfied with in the 4th volume. There was a sang-sang on everyone's back, and they had to flee thousands of miles in the face of the world. The bowstring was broken like a mess of a zither. Eldest brother came to the White Tower Temple, the bloody battle in the quagmire, the war in the wilderness, and Ning Kei's dream became reality. The headmaster was really as high as the sky. He borrowed a sword from the south, and then he killed the giant golden dragon and the divine general. Then he waved his hand and the wind and rain fell. He was indeed a great foodie. The 3 of them traveled around the world, thinking about this world and told the story of the past. By the Sisui River, Song Song's white lotus feet and dark body finally had meaning. The headmaster ascended to heaven and turned into a bright moon. It rained heavily in the human world. Ning Kei howled like a wolf in the wilderness after the rain. Then the whole world attacked the Tang Empire, the moon rose from the verdant canyon, the eldest brother Wu Ju fought against the Abbey Dean, the cicadas for 23 years, the hierarch became an idiot, Ning Kei beheaded the emperor, and the millions of people in Chang'an used their blades. Finally, the word appeared in the sky for the first time. I finished all the plots in 2 paragraphs. As I was writing, I was combing the images in my head and I was even a little excited. It was the same for the 4 chapters yesterday. The Empress jumped off the city wall, which was decided at the beginning of the book. In this great romance story, there must be a couple of lovers doing this kind of old-fashioned, but sometimes very touching demonstration. In the Qing dynasty there was also an empress who jumped off the city wall, but it was completely different. I had always liked the empress, but it was a pity that I didn't have enough foreshadowing because of the angle and the number of words. But there was no other way. If I really wrote those things thoroughly, people would definitely say that it was a joke. The drunkard conveyed the words to Ning Kei on behalf of someone. Every death in the world is a reunion after a long separation. This was seen from a grandmaster. Wang Zhou's words, every death in the world is a reunion after a long separation. It was indeed bitter. The reason why I wrote it this way was that I couldn't think of a better way to express it, and I thought it was more reasonable than the movie, because this sentence had a specific meaning in the story, instead of being purely emotional. As for what the truth of this sentence was, please refer to the 5th volume. As I said before, I liked all the titles, but I didn't know if I liked the 5th volume because, until now, I hadn't figured out the title of the 5th volume. I was very anxious. The beginning of the last volume already made me anxious. It was really troublesome to have the 2 together. I was supposed to write it today because I had used up today's holiday a few days ago. But after thinking about it, I had to stop writing for 1 day. I just made up for my debt, so I didn't want to owe more. At least, I wanted to maintain the dignity of an old man. I would use next Saturday to make up for today so that I didn't owe any debt. Please understand. In April, the new chapter would be more than 160,000 words. It was not that I was too tired after writing 4 chapters yesterday, but simply because I couldn't decide on the title of the 5th volume, and the first few chapters of the 5th volume were too troublesome and difficult to write. The 5th volume was indeed difficult to write. The overall framework had already been decided. The ceiling of the human world had already been laid. The battle situation had already been decided. It was as solid as a quagmire. To break out of the situation, especially a situation with new ideas, was very difficult. I had already thought of a method, but I didn't know if I had the ability to realize that method. My current mood was like when I wrote about Fan Xian going to Jiangnan in the year of Qingyu. I was terrified to death. But looking back, this kind of panic was a very good thing because the Jiangnan volume of the year of Qingyu was, without a doubt, the most solid. In terms of standard, it was the best volume. So, I hoped that Jiang Ye's 5th volume could also be done to this level. But the style of the next volume would definitely be completely different from the one in the year of Qingyu. I had my own ambitions. I wanted to put the large and open things into a very small bag, and cover the dark and bloody things with beautiful silk. I hoped that by the end of the 5th volume, everyone will feel that the method I chose was awesome and innovative. Then I will feel happy. I will report this to you and look forward to your encouragement. After finishing the first volume, Jiang Yi held a very successful book review competition. Today, when the fourth volume ends, the new book review competition will also officially begin. Everyone is welcome to participate. For the specific details, please go to the book review section to take a look at the top posts. In another 2 days, I will also specially post a single chapter. Finally, I sincerely wish you a happy life, good health, good luck in everything, and happy reading. Good night. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 834. The gate of the divine kingdom was destroyed. The vault of heaven shook and then cracks appeared. Countless white stones, neither gold nor jade, burst out from the cracks, pierced the blue sky, and fell to the human world with a whistling sound. Tens of thousands of meteorites with fiery tails fell on the quiet ocean, setting off terrifying huge waves and scorching hot fog. Countless birds and fish died, and their bodies rose and fell with the waves. Among the meteorites all over the sky, there was a stone that was different from the others. It was an almost transparent crystal. It drew a bright arc in the vault of heaven, and fell to the cold snow sea in the far north. It was almost the everlasting night here. The dark night was like a curtain. Under the dim starlight, one could see a majestic and terrifying snow-capped peak. The snow-capped peak was very high, and its peak seemed to pierce the night sky. The crystal-like transparent stone flew from afar, and drew a bright line in the air, illuminating the dark night sky for a moment, and then crashed into the snow-capped peak. With a boom, the thick snow that had accumulated for thousands of years fell down, revealing a piece of cliff stone. One could vaguely see a dark hole with a circumference of 10 feet, which might have penetrated deep into the belly of the mountain. The falling snow continued to fall, and it didn't take long for the hole to be filled up. The sound of the collision dispersed to the high night sky, the ice sea and the Black Sea on both sides of the snow-capped peak, and the world became quiet again. Except for the sound of the frozen trees cracking, the world around the snow-capped peak was absolutely quiet. This state lasted for a while, and suddenly there was a whistling sound of wind, followed by a heavy rain. This was the northernmost part of the world, the coldest and the darkest place. It had never rained for tens of thousands of years, but this rain lasted for several months as if it would never stop. The heavy rain kept falling, and the snow on the surface of the hot sea was beaten into countless black holes, which looked like the exits of an ant's nest. The Black Sea on the other side of the mountain was also shaken by the heavy rain, and the ink-like seawater was covered with tiny bubbles of various shapes, which looked a little disgusting, but also like there were many schools of fish in it. At the same time, the snow on the snow-capped peak was constantly washed away, and the original color of the mountain was gradually revealed. It was a deep black, mottled with the remaining ice and snow. The heavy rain, which had lasted for several months, suddenly stopped at a certain moment. It was very sudden, just like the moment when the sky began to rain. The world around the snow-capped peak became quiet again. Suddenly, a hurricane came from the night sky and blew away the dark clouds, revealing the starry sky and the new moon. The quiet Black Sea was blown by the hurricane, and the snow on the surface of the hot sea was blown away by the white smoke. The traces left by the rainstorm were instantly wiped away. The silence after the wind stopped was suddenly broken by a voice. It was as if someone had pushed open a door between heaven and earth. That door had not been opened for tens of thousands of years and had long been rusted. That was why the creaking sound was so heavy. The sound became louder and louder, echoing between heaven and earth. The world of ice and snow seemed very uneasy. The surface of the hot sea cracked open, and some peony fishes jumped out from the depths of the sea. They were instantly frozen into transparent jade fish by the severe cold. Another dozen black crows flew over from the south, cawing and perched on the frost-covered branches. The black crows looked at the snow-capped peak where the sound came from. This snow-capped peak was the farthest, coldest and highest peak in the world. It was mottled by the rainstorm a few days ago, and now it looked like a rusty iron stick standing between heaven and earth. A dark stone edge appeared in the middle of the snow-capped peak, and it was spreading and expanding at a speed visible to the naked eye. The heavy rocks of the mountain were deformed and torn by friction, constantly making ear-piercing sounds. The horrible creaking sound was not the sound of the rusty door being pushed open, but the rusty iron stick about to break. As time went by, the sound of the cliff breaking became more and more clear, and the black stone crack became bigger and bigger. The upper half of the snow-capped peak fell backward faster and faster. Finally, one day the snow-capped peak broke in the middle, and the upper half of the mountain fell into the Black Sea behind the mountain with deafening sounds of friction and collision. Heaven and earth shook, and huge waves dozens of feet high were set off in the Black Sea. The shells and sand that had sunk to the bottom of the sea for tens of thousands of years were shaken out of the sea, scattered everywhere, and then swept away by the huge waves. More than 10 days later, the tide suddenly rose on the coast of the great river kingdom. The fishermen were very surprised. They could not understand why there were waves when the sky was clear and there was only a gentle breeze. No one knew that these waves came from the farthest Black Sea. The Black Sea and the remaining half of the snow-capped peak had brought many shocks and doubts to the human world. At this time, the snow-capped peak had become quiet again, and the bright moonlight and starlight quietly shone on the broken section of the snow-capped peak. The broken section of the snow-capped peak was not smooth, and it looked like the broken stubble of a willow tree that had been forcibly broken. Sharp rocks protruded from the black cliff, like a dangerous stone forest. There was a white spot among the black cliff rocks. It was a naked woman. Her skin was as white as fresh snow. No matter the warm moonlight or the cold starlight fell on her body, it did not leave any color, only pure whiteness. Her eyes were closed as if she was sleeping. Her slender and slightly curled eyelashes did not tremble at all. Her appearance was ordinary, or it could be said that there was no special feature, and there was a childish feeling between her eyebrows. Compared with the ordinary appearance, her body was very special. Her skin was as smooth as satin, and there was not even the slightest scar. Her body was very plump, and under the moonlight and starlight, it had a jade-like texture. Among the black cliff rocks, it was like a snow-white steamed bun on a black porcelain plate. Her eyelashes fluttered, and she opened her eyes to wake up. She got up and looked around. She was very tall when she stood up, even taller than ordinary men. There was no impurity or emotion in her eyes, only the purest black and white. She noticed that the starlight between the cliffs was a little bright. She looked up and saw the bright moon in the night sky. This was the scene she had seen in her dream many years ago, and it was also the scene she hated the most. Therefore, she frowned slightly, and there was a trace of intelligence in her. She finally had the breath of life. The snow-capped peak was the highest place in the world. Even though a small part of it was broken, the cliff was still the closest to the night sky, which meant that it was the closest to the bright moon. She did not like the bright moon, so she decided to leave. There were many sharp rocks on the surface of the cliff. Even the most powerful cultivators in the world would find it troublesome to walk among them. However, she did not care at all. She walked casually, and when her bare feet stepped on the ground, a pure white lotus would appear under her feet, supporting her plump but seemingly weightless body. Between the black cliff and the snow-capped peak, white lotus flowers bloomed and lined up, forming a straight mountain path that led directly to the bottom of the snow-capped peak. She stepped on the lotus flowers and her skin rippled. More than 10 black crows flew to the bottom of the snow-capped peak to welcome her return, or rather, arrival. In their beaks, they held exotic wildflowers and green grass, flying around her non-stop. The black crows sprinkled the wildflowers and green grass in their beaks on her naked body, and then they cawed and flew to the sky hundreds of feet high. She had an extra blue dress embroidered with flowers on it. Looking at the clothes on her, she felt that something was hard to understand. She loosened her clothes and loosened the belt on her waist, but found it was still a little tight. She could not help but frown slightly. She walked to the snow on the surface of the hot sea, and looked at the dozens of peony fish that had been frozen into jade. Something seemed to occur to her. After a moment of silence, she walked to the south. The white lotus grew on the soles of her feet. At the very beginning she had walked 1,000 miles. In the next 2 hours she had walked 300 miles. Then it took her a day to walk to the edge of the snowland. She found that she was moving slower and slower, and the aura in her body was getting more and more turbid. She frowned more and more tightly, and her transparent eyes were filled with some coldness and anger. She was not used to this filthy world, and she was not used to such a slow speed. What she was most unaccustomed to and did not understand was why her body was so plump. Although she walked slowly, she was not tired, so she finally walked to the wilderness. She saw the wilderness after the rain, the yellowish autumn grass, and the few tents that emitted a rotten smell. This was a small tribe of the Golden Tribe royal court. Many people had died, and the rotten flesh on the bodies had been eaten by the beasts on the grassland. It seemed that they had been dead for many days. She casually glanced at the tents and saw everything clearly. The killer used a heavy iron saber and was used to cutting people's throats. She frowned again because she remembered the iron saber. She also remembered that the killer liked to cut people's throats with the iron saber, because he said that it was the easiest and the most reliable way. She was silent for a short while and then stopped thinking about it. As long as she killed the killer and erased the history of the human world, those memories would naturally disappear. She felt a little hungry, so she found more than a dozen bags of horse milk wine in the tent. She stood among the bones and drank all the wine. In her eyes, there was no difference between humans and grass, so there was no difference between these bones and her grass-woven clothes. Naturally, she would not have such a low-level physiological reaction as disgust. Moreover, she was a good drinker and liked drinking. She drank more than a dozen bags of horse milk wine in a short while, and her expression did not change at all. But when she looked at her plump body, she showed a look of disgust again. At this moment, there was a hurried sound of hooves and whistles outside the tent. It sounded a little messy. She listened quietly for a while and then walked out of the tent. More than a dozen cavalrymen of the Golden Palace galloped to her. Judging from their equipment, they should be the vanguard of the army. The cavalrymen smelled the rotten smell in the tent, and their expressions suddenly changed. They pulled out the machetes from their waists, pointed at her, and shouted at her. But she did not know what they were saying. This was the first group of people she saw in the human world, so she decided to forgive them for their disrespect. She would not let the anger of the divine punishment fall on them, but let them die directly. She walked to the cavalryman without any emotion on her face. Volume 5, title, Stroke of Genius. It took me half a night to come up with this, and I am very satisfied. The more I read, the more I like it. It is so appropriate to the content of this volume. What a stroke of genius. There are still 3 hours before midnight, and I am only 200 votes away from the top 4, and 400 votes away from the top 3. Students, such an interesting thing can be done. I'm going to write the second chapter, and the title of these chapters must be very interesting. Continue to ask for monthly votes and next month's monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 835. Looking at the girl in cyan walking towards them, the cavalrymen of the Golden Palace had mixed feelings. Some were confused, some were shocked, and some were vigilant. They could not understand why she was not afraid of their sharp machetes and why she could be so calm, as if she had seen nothing. One of the cavalrymen shouted and raised his machete high. However, looking at her indifferent face, he could not bring his machete down because he was too scared. Except for being tall and plump, she looked so ordinary. She did not have any weapon in her hand, nor did she have the aura of a powerhouse. However, the cavalryman was inexplicably scared when he saw her face. He just wanted to throw his machete far away and kneel before her to ask for her forgiveness. The leader of the cavalrymen shouted, which should be the siren's order. He drew his machete from the scabbard and chopped at her head without hesitation. If one looked closely, one could see that he had closed his eyes tightly when he chopped, because he was not confident that he could muster up his courage after seeing her ordinary face. The sharp machete fell on her head. No hair was cut off, no blood was shed, and there was no cruel scene. There was not even a sound of impact. It was as if the machete had cut into the vast sea. Then countless rays of light suddenly appeared on the machete and instantly melted into nothingness. The flowers embroidered on her cyan clothes began to flutter. Countless rays of the purest light were released from the petals and instantly spread out, covering the entire meadow around the tent. After a moment, she walked out of the light and continued to walk towards the south. The light on the grassland gradually faded. More than 10 cavalrymen of the Golden Palace had fallen to the ground and were no longer breathing. So were the warhorses. However, there was no wound or blood on them. The rancid smell in the tent had also disappeared. The rotten flesh on the corpses had all been melted, leaving only the clean bones. This was purification. The next day she met humans again. This time, there were more people on the grassland, consisting of several carriages and hundreds of cavalrymen. The hoofbeats were as dense as thunder. However, in her eyes, these humans were no different from the grass at her feet. Therefore, she continued to move forward as if she had seen nothing. An old man in plain grassland clothes sat in the carriage, looking at the grassland scenery outside the window in silence. He was the most respected nation master of the Golden Palace. After leaving Helan City, he had been cruising in the depths of the grassland. Apart from thinking about something, the main reason was that he did not want to follow the ambitious Chanyu to the south. In his opinion, the Golden Palace should not intervene in the war against Tang. The fiercer the Central Plains was, the more peaceful the grassland would be. Besides, the two powerhouses of the Devil's Doctrine in front of Helan City made him a little vigilant. There were hundreds of elite cavalrymen of the Golden Palace accompanying the nation master. Because of the supreme status of the people of the grassland, the cavalrymen of the Golden Palace were all vigilant. Especially the grassland was still because of the grassland which they sent out the scouts yesterday. The cavalrymen of the cavalrymen were the nation of the nation riding on palace. The red, the cavalrymen, and the cavalrymen because of the cavalrymen because of the grassland as was. At this moment the cavalrymen saw the young girl. She was so tall, and her cyan clothes were tightly wrapped around her plump body. She was so eye-catching that it was hard not to see her clearly. Just like the cavalryman who died yesterday, everyone who saw her ordinary face was inexplicably terrified. Their hands holding the hilt of their swords began to tremble. They were the most elite cavalrymen of the Golden Palace, and the nation master was even more powerful. There were also 2 high priests in the team. If such a terrifying team could directly destroy the small countries in the south, even the Tang Empire and the West Hill Divine Palace would not dare to underestimate them. However, seeing the young girl walking slowly, they felt fear. This fear confused them but also made them even more terrified. The nation master looked at the young girl in the meadow. Suddenly the wrinkles on his face deepened, and his eye sockets deepened. Gradually, a shocked expression appeared on his face, as if he had seen an existence that did not belong to the human world. The cavalrymen did not understand why they would be inexplicably terrified when they saw the young girl's ordinary face. That was because they were ordinary people, but the nation master was not. Her face was indeed very ordinary, extremely ordinary. If she walked into the crowd, no one would be able to find her. No one could even remember what she looked like. Her eyebrows were the most common eyebrows among millions of people. Her eyes were the most common eyes among millions of people. Her nose was the most common nose among millions of people. Her lips were the most common lips that could be seen everywhere. This kind of ordinary was the most extraordinary. This ordinary made her extraordinary. There had never been such an ordinary person in the human world, and there should not be such an ordinary person. Therefore, it only took the nation master a very short time to understand where she came from and who she was. The nation master knelt down in the autumn grass. He touched the ground with his forehead and spread out his palms. He looked extremely reverent and pious. Tears streamed down his face as he said in a trembling voice, "Longevity heaven." The headmaster of the academy ascended to heaven at the bank of the Sisui River. He first threw Ning Kai to the distant wilderness in the north, and then went straight to the blue sky with the light. After that, thousands of streams of fire fell, and then there was a heavy rain in the human world. When the rain fell, there was no one by the Sisui River, but there was a black horse. The big black horse stared at the sky. Until this moment, it still did not understand what had happened before. Why did the little black girl suddenly become so beautiful? Why did the old man suddenly become an immortal? And why did Ning Kai the idiot fly? The rain continued and gradually became cold. The big black horse kicked its hooves in confusion, kicking up a lot of wet mud. Then it lowered its head and snorted weakly. The big black horse did not leave but waited by the Sisui River. It wanted to wait for Ning Kai to come back. It was worried that if it left and Ning Kai could not find it, he would be very anxious. Of course, the most important reason was that if Ning Kai did not come back, the carriage made of stainless steel was too heavy for it to drag back to Chang'an. Well, if Ning Kai really came back, it was willing to drag the carriage back to Chang, and even if it was a little hard, as long as that guy really came back. The rain did not stop. The big black horse waited in the rain by the Sisui River for a day and a night. Its wild mane was soaked like a rag and hung on its neck, looking very miserable and pitiful. It was very dissatisfied with the willow trees planted by the Sisui River. The willow trees were not dense enough to shelter it from the rain. It was very jealous of the carriage, which was not afraid of the cold and was washed so clean by the heavy rain. The big black horse waited for another 3 days. When it was thirsty, it drank some rainwater. When it was hungry, it found some grass by the river and chewed casually. A passerby wanted to take it away, but it pushed him into the Sisui River. The county government received the report and sent a runner to take it away. The runner was sprayed with saliva and then kicked out 3 times in the air. But Ning Kai did not come back. The little black girl did not come back, and the old man did not come back either. Its mane had absorbed the rainwater and became wet and heavy, pressing its usually proud head lower and lower, as if its strong neck could no longer bear the weight. In the early morning of the 5th day, there was a little light in the sky through the heavy rain. The big black horse raised its head and neighed angrily at the blue sky and the Sisui River. It dragged the heavy carriage and began its journey. It did not intend to go back to Chang'an or the academy because those guys did not come back. and it had faintly sensed that those guys probably would not come back. The big black horse decided to go to the wilderness. It still remembered that when it crossed the quagmire, it had met a senior from the academy there. The senior did not pull the carriage but only rode it. He lived a very free and casual life and had thousands of subordinates, so it decided to rely on that senior. Without Ning Ke to activate the talisman array, the carriage made of fine steel was unimaginably heavy. Only the big black horse could pull it. But the long journey from the Sisui River to the wilderness would be a long one. As long as it could find that senior, it would be the second master of the wilderness. During the difficult journey, the big black horse comforted and encouraged itself with a bright future. It gritted its teeth, lowered its head and walked desperately in the storm. It actually made it from the Sisui River to the wilderness. The heavy rain finally stopped. The big black horse was covered with mud and lost a lot of weight. It looked very haggard, but its eyes were extremely bright and energetic when it looked at the fertile grassland in front of it. The wind mixed with the fragrance of broken grass brushed its nose. It took a deep breath and looked very intoxicated. It thought to itself, is this the so-called taste of freedom? Suddenly, it looked back at the heavy black carriage and felt that it was really a fool. Since it was going to seek freedom and become the second master, why did it have to drag this damn heavy thing for thousands of miles? What if Ning Ke was still alive and found it in the future? The big black horse comforted itself and then continued to the swamp in the west of the wilderness. In fact, it thought so. The journey to seek freedom ended on an ordinary autumn day. On that day, a girl walked out from the depths of the grassland. The girl's appearance was ordinary without any special features. She was wearing a cyan dress embroidered with beautiful flowers. The big black horse wanted to convince itself that it did not know her. How could she be so fat and tall, and how could her breast be so soft and big? But it knew that it was her. So it whistled twice, got rid of the carriage and turned to run. The big black horse had never run so fast in its life. Even when it chased the snow-white mare in the wilderness contest, it did not run so fast. It ran faster than Ning Ke's arrow. The wind whistled past and the big black horse was very scared. Then it fell heavily in the autumn grass and dust flew everywhere. She was sitting on the back of the big black horse. The big black horse was very scared. The little black skinny girl had really become a big white fat girl. Was there any justice in this world? I like these 2 chapters very much. They are the first 2 chapters that I feel most comfortable writing in all the 5 volumes. There is still half an hour left, only 100 votes away from the top 4. Clap, everyone. Thank you. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 836. The big black horse's thoughts did not make any sense. Since she was heaven, then everything she thought and did was heaven's justice. The big black horse was too fast when he ran away. Even though it was only a short time, he had already run hundreds of feet. She put her hands behind her back and walked toward the grassland. The big black horse did not dare to try to escape anymore. He followed her dejectedly. The indigo dress was tight around her waist because she was a little fat. The big black horse looked at her back with fear in his eyes. He thought of the blue satin tied around the waist of the calligraphy addict in the wilderness and could not help but feel infinite regret. He scolded Ning Ke in his heart, I told you that woman was better, but you didn't listen to me. Returning to the original spot, she looked at the dusty black carriage and walked in after a moment of silence. She saw the old black umbrella and the iron box in the corner of the carriage. She sat beside the iron box and reached out her fingers to slowly stroke the surface of the box. She smoothed the scattered dust. Her fingers were very steady and the dust was evenly smooth. Then she looked at the faintly visible Tianqi mountain in the southeast, still silent. The big black horse knew what he should do. He stepped on the grass and was ready to move forward. Sweat oozed from his dark and smooth skin and instantly wet his dirty mane. He was annoyed and had used all his strength, but still could not move the carriage one step. She reached out her right hand and put it on the wall of the carriage. No one knew what she did. A very faint light flashed and the talisman array on the wall of the carriage was instantly activated. The carriage began to move forward. A carriage could only pass through Helan City if it wanted to pass through the Tianqi Mountains. At this time, the Tang army had already retreated to the south. There were only a dozen Tang soldiers left in Helan City. It was like an empty city. Although there were only a dozen of them, they still began to be alert and ready to fight when they saw the black carriage coming. At this time she lifted the curtain and looked at the top of the city wall. The city gate of Helan City, which the Golden Tribe royal court could not open, was slowly opened under her gaze. The black carriage entered Helan City, passed through the valley and went to the east wilderness. It was not until the black horse carriage disappeared from their sight that the Tang soldiers came to their senses. Their eyes were filled with confusion and shock. They clearly remembered what had happened, but they did not understand why they would open the city gates so obediently. What had happened? The black carriage passed through the eastern wilderness, passed through the border villages, entered the Yan kingdom and continued south. Along the way they walked through barren mountains and wild ridges. There were hardly any signs of human habitation, but she still did not speak. One day the black horse carriage arrived at a small town at the border of the Yan kingdom and the Song kingdom. The town was very small and ordinary. There was only one narrow street, and the houses along the street were old and simple. The market was filled with the smell of rotten vegetables and chicken droppings. If one sniffed carefully they could even smell the unique stench of salted fish. This place was remote and had not been affected by the flames of war, but their lives were inevitably affected. Other than food, it was obvious that business was much more difficult than before. The butcher's shop at the east end of the street was the only one in town. It was usually very lively during the big market, but today it was so quiet that even the flies felt bored. The black carriage stopped in front of the butcher's shop. She stepped out of the carriage and looked at her towering breasts and tight clothes. She frowned slightly, still unable to hide her disgust towards her full and plump body. Although business was not good, the butcher was in a good mood. He did not rely on this butcher's shop to make a living. At this time he was chopping the smoked ribs from last winter, preparing to cook them with wine later. Hearing the footsteps, he looked up and was slightly surprised to see the girl in green walking into the butcher's shop. He wondered which family this fat girl was married to and why he had never seen her before. Then he lowered his head and continued chopping the meat. With every chop of the sharp and heavy meat knife, the grease on the knife surface would splash up, and the thick chopping board would shake non-stop. She walked to the butcher and watched him quietly, as if she was very interested in him chopping the meat. At first, the butcher did not have any reaction, only minding his own business. Then, his breathing gradually became rapid, like an old man who was suffering from a serious illness. His sturdy chest kept emitting the sound of bellows, and the hand holding the hilt of the saber trembled slightly. The fear in his eyes grew stronger, and the speed at which he chopped the meat became slower and slower. Then he began to sweat, and beads of sweat the size of soybeans appeared on his forehead, but he did not dare to wipe them. He could only let the sweat fall into the pile of ribs, and then be chopped into countless pieces by the meat knife, difficult to separate. The butcher's hand trembled even more violently, and finally deviated, chopping his own finger. With a muffled sound, countless years of grease and wood splashed from the bottom of the chopping board. With a crack appeared on the chopping board, which was nearly half the height of a person as it was chopped open. The momentum of the saber was endless and the meat table was cut in two. Immediately after, an extremely deep crack appeared on the blood-soaked meat table. This crack was extremely dark and it was impossible to see how deep it was. Only the faint sound of flowing water could be heard. It seemed to be an underground river. This was such a terrifying knife. It clearly chopped on a finger and did not fall on the chopping board, but it could cut the case and split the ground and go straight to the yellow springs in the netherworld. What was even more shocking was that when such a terrifying knife heavily chopped down on Butcher's finger, it actually didn't cut off his finger. Instead, it only left a shallow white mark. What was this person's body made of? However, such a person did not even dare to look at her. Under her calm gaze, he was so terrified that he seemed to be going crazy. The butcher looked at the ribs scattered on the floor and opened his mouth, showing his yellow teeth, as if he were about to cry or laugh at himself. Suddenly, he dropped the heavy meat knife in his hand to the ground, squatted down, and wept bitterly with his head in his arms, still not daring to look up at her. "Are the ribs too meaty? I'll go to the palace of the Kingdom of Song later to get some chameleon grass to go with it. It's the best in the world for removing grease and adding flavor. It's just that I don't understand." The drunkard walked in from outside the butcher's shop. When he saw the situation in the shop, the blade, and the butcher who was crying like a kid who saw a ghost, his voice stopped abruptly. He opened his mouth and wanted to say something, but found that his throat was so dry that he could not make a sound. Only the flagon on his waist kept swaying in the cold winter wind, making a whirring sound. He looked at the girl in indigo and his face instantly turned extremely pale. His eyes were filled with shock because he could not understand what he had seen and how could this happen. The butcher's shop was silent. The drunkard gradually calmed down, or at least his expression became normal. He asked with a hoarse and respectful voice, "May I ask who you are?" Where do you come from? Where are you going? For her, the last two questions were not questions, but the first one was. So she thought for a while and looked at somewhere in the world with her hands behind her back, thinking about something in the past. The flagon stopped swaying and the cold winter wind began to wreak havoc. In an instant, the drunkard disappeared from the butcher's shop. The drunkard went to the great dike by the storm sea in the kingdom of Song, then he went to the Lank temple, and then he went to a nest of water bandits in the middle of the great swamp. He even went to Chang'an and stayed in front of the academy for a while. Finally, he chose to go to a small island deep in the South Sea, because he believed that Chen Mao would not make a mistake. He only stayed for a short time on the small island that was filled with hot mist. In that instant, the tide rose and fell, the sun set and the moon rose, and this was repeated 3 times. The drunkard had spent 3 days in the blink of an eye. He was willing to pay a high price for such a marvelous power. He was willing to do anything as long as he did not die in order to avoid the enemy. The drunkard stood on the black reef in the morning light, and looked to the far north. No matter how far his eyesight was, he still could not see the mainland. But he did not feel sad and instead felt relieved. At this moment he felt that he had roughly understood Chen Mao's feelings back then. Even if he could not step on the mainland for the rest of his life, so what? Throughout his long life, apart from Evernight, he had only experienced this feeling of surviving a calamity when that old ox pulled a broken carriage into the small town one day. Even those 2 times were not as strong and soul-stirring as this time. The drunkard felt very lucky. He mourned for the butcher and wanted to drink some wine to celebrate. He took the flagon from his waist and was about to raise it in front of him. Suddenly, a white hand came to him through the sea wind and took the flagon away. The hand moved so naturally and casually that he could not refuse. She picked up the flagon and began to drink. Some of the wine spilled on her cyan dress and then she finished it. She threw the flagon back to the drunkard. The two returned to the small town. 3 days had passed and the smell of chicken feces in the market grew stronger. But nothing changed in the butcher's shop. The butcher no longer hugged his head and cried, nor did he dare to run away. He stood in the corner with his head down. The drunkard was limitless and limitless. He could think for 3 days. His state was indeed unfathomable. It could even be said that he had understood the most advanced rules of time and space in the world of Haotian. However, she was Haotian and this was her world. She was the rule. No matter how much the drunkard and the butcher understood, they were still within the rules. How could they stay away from her? Good wine. She looked at the drunkard and said. It was the first time she spoke in the human world. Her voice was flat, and it was difficult to express her emotions. But it did not sound mechanical but rather ethereal, transparent and empty. She only said 2 words but it sounded like countless syllables at the same time. It was so complicated that it was like the most beautiful music or more like all the sounds of nature. Anyone who heard this voice would feel awe. The higher the state, the more they could feel the holiness in the voice, and the more they wanted to worship such a great existence. Even the drunkard and the butcher felt the same. I'm really not feeling well today. It's hard to write. This is the first chapter. Keep up the good work. Please vote more monthly, and try to finish the next chapter before 12:40. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 837. Preserved meat needs to be smoked with pine smoke for a month to be tasty. She looked at the butcher and said the second sentence in the human world. The butcher's shop became even quieter after she said that. The drunkard and the butcher had complicated expressions on their faces. They were a little shocked and a little confused. First praising the wine, then the preserved meat. In their imagination, how could they hear such mundane words coming out of her mouth? She frowned slightly. She probably didn't expect herself to say that, and she couldn't understand why she still remembered those meaningless things in her consciousness and even said them out loud. After she said those 2 sentences, the sacred sound of nature coming out of her body gradually became normal. It was still ethereal and quiet, but no longer complicated and incomprehensible. The drunkard asked her 3 questions. Those were the 3 questions that he had never figured out in his long life. They were also the answers that many philosophers and priests in human history were still searching for until their death. The reason why he asked her was that he hoped that she also didn't figure out the 3 questions that seemed a bit mundane because they had appeared too many times, but were actually still ingenious. He wanted to distract her a little so that he could escape again. However, as he sighed in front of Chang, and since Haotian had come to the human world, how could she not find him and the butcher? In fact, she never thought about why the drunkard asked those 3 questions. She had already found the answers to those questions. Or it could be said that those 3 questions were meaningless to her before, but now they were meaningful. That was why she looked into the distance thoughtfully with her hands behind her back. Finally she made a decision. Looking at the drunkard and the butcher, she said emotionlessly, "If the first question refers to the name between us, you can call me Sang Sang." Her name was Sang Sang. She was Sang Sang. But after she decided to use that name, she suddenly felt a great hatred, just like how she hated the 2 sentences about wine and meat. Hearing the name, the drunkard and the butcher confirmed it. Their unwillingness and fear gradually subsided, and they smiled bitterly. The drunkard said respectfully, "I heard that you have returned to the divine kingdom, but I didn't expect you to still be in the human world." Sang Sang said, "I have something to do." The butcher glanced at the drunkard, but the drunkard didn't seem to notice it and didn't respond to him. Sang Sang asked, "Are you 2 willing to work for me?" The drunkard said bitterly, "It's a great honor to do things for heaven. But we've been hiding in front of you for tens of thousands of years. We're exhausted." She looked at the furnishings of the butcher shop with her hands behind her back and said, "The 2 of you can be considered strange among ants. You can already fly very high, but you still want to live in such a shabby ant hole. How foolish." The drunkard said, "The divine kingdom of Haotian is your residence. We dare not disturb you." Sang Sang said, "I will grant you immortality." The drunkard and the butcher remained silent. If faith could bring them eternal life, they would have joined Haotian Taoism and become the most devout followers of Haotian before the last everlasting night. Sang Sang looked at them and said indifferently, "The real immortality." The drunkard and the butcher saw her eyes and could not leave. Her eyes were transparent and beautiful, without any impurities. There was real starlight in the deepest part of her eyes, and every starlight was an independent divine kingdom. Those divine kingdoms were formed by the fascinating origin of the world and had a kind of eternal beauty endowed by time. No matter how the world changed, it was still solemn. What shocked them most was that they saw the existence of self-consciousness in that divine kingdom. As the self-consciousness fluctuated, the perfect lines formed by rules changed into countless lights and shadows. The drunkard and the butcher gradually bent their knees and knelt in front of her. They had been hiding from Haotian for tens of thousands of years, but they were finally found by Haotian. They saw the divine kingdom that Haotian gave them and believed that it was real. What else could they ask for? Sang Sang walked out of the butcher's shop, followed by the drunkard and the butcher humbly. She waved her hand, and the reins around the neck of the big black horse fell off like petals and separated from the carriage. She took out the big black umbrella from the carriage and held it in her hand. She turned around and looked at the drunkard, saying emotionlessly, "Tell him that every death in the world is a reunion after a long separation." After saying that, she led the big black horse and left the small town. The drunkard and the butcher stood at the door of the butcher shop and watched the person and the horse go away. They did not speak for a long time because they were still in extreme shock and even doubted that what they saw today was fake. Haotian's arrival in the human world was not recorded in any religious classics or even in myths and legends. According to the description of Taoism, Haotian was the beginning of all things in the world. It was shapeless and could have countless shapes. It could be as big as the universe or as small as a grain of sand. It was omniscient and omnipotent. It was not so hard to imagine that it could turn into a white and fat girl and fall into the human world. However, the drunkard and the butcher still could not accept the reality, because they could not imagine that Haotian could have the shape of a human, and they could not imagine that they really had a conversation with Haotian. After a long time, the drunkard and the butcher recovered from the shock. The butcher looked at the heavy carriage and said, "It's a long journey to Chang'an, and the carriage is too heavy. Haotian did not allow me to help you, so I have to trouble you." The drunkard said, "I did not resist or hide, so there was no punishment. Although I did not dare to resist, I tried to escape. This is the punishment for the limitless state that I was most proud of." Who could reach the limitless state while carrying a carriage that was as heavy as a small mountain? The butcher said after a moment of silence, "Go to the academy in Chang'an and check on Ning Quebec. Since Haotian valued him, there must be a reason. If it doesn't work, kill him." A white, fat and tall girl led a skinny black horse and walked in the woods, lakes and rivers in the human world. No one knew who she was, where she came from, or where she was going. She wore a blue dress with flowers. Because she was a little small, or because her body was much more voluptuous than the design, the dress was always tight, revealing her soft and elastic curves. She led the black horse to some places including small towns, big cities and rural villages. Some men occasionally looked at her body in a strange way, but she did not care. Some women looked at her and turned away in disgust, but she still did not care. No one cared about the comments of ants. When passing by a county in the kingdom of Song, she suddenly felt hungry and wanted a bowl of noodles. The feeling of hunger was not unfamiliar to her body, but to her, this feeling was still unfamiliar. Moreover, it was filled with a lowly biological nature, which made her feel very disgusted. More importantly, according to God's calculation, even if she was a little fat now and needed to eat more, she should not need to eat for at least half a year after drinking a dozen bags of horse milk wine in the wilderness and drinking thousands of barrels of wine in the drunkard's flagon in the small town. Then why was she hungry? She thought about this in silence, but did not notice that she had led the black horse to the front of a noodle shop. It was late winter, and the streets of the county were covered with a thin layer of snow, which was then trampled into black mud by pedestrians. She had not worn shoes since she came out of the broken peak. Her feet were as naked as lotuses, which were particularly eye-catching in the black water. There were 2 stoves behind the noodle shop, and the water in the pot was boiling, giving off a pleasant light smell of cooked noodles. The smell of coriander on the noodle shop was even stronger. Sang Sang stood in front of the noodle shop for a while, and decided to eat a bowl of noodles. No one paid attention to her, nor did the owner of the noodle shop receive her, as if no one noticed that her bare feet were stepping on the black snow mud, but she did not show any sign of being afraid of the cold. The noodle shop was very lively and noisy at this time, not because the business was good, but because someone was making trouble here. The owner of the noodle shop had a 12-year-old girl who was in charge of making noodles. Some green-skinned ruffians wanted her noodles and flirted with her, saying that the noodles were the best. Thus this noisy dispute occurred. Although the father of the noodle shop was trembling with anger, he did not have the courage to pick up a kitchen knife to reason with them. The ruffians' voices became louder and louder. "I want to eat noodles." Sang Sang looked at the owner of the noodle shop and said in an awkward tone. Because she felt that eating noodles was very awkward in itself, and the owner of the noodle shop was even more awkward than her, so he naturally ignored her. Sang Sang was a little unhappy and said with a dignified expression, "I want to eat noodles." Still no one paid attention to her, and the ruffians began to yell and smash the noodle shop. It was a mess. Pots and pans were thrown everywhere, and a full basin of coriander fell on the ground. Sang Sang looked down and saw the coriander mixed into the black snow mud. She felt a little pity, and then she began to hate her own reaction because the feeling of pity was also very cheap. The smashing sound became louder and louder. The owner of the noodle shop was bleeding and sat on the ground, paralyzed. The little girl squatted beside her father and kept crying, and the ruffians seemed to have no intention of stopping. Sang Sang forgave the owner of the noodle shop for being disrespectful, and felt that the sesame seed cake across the street also seemed very fragrant. However, when she was about to leave, she heard the owner's painful prayer. "God, if you have eyes, why don't you take care of these bastards?" Sang Sang stopped and slightly lowered her head. The big black horse looked at her and vaguely felt that he was about to witness the most famous scene in the history of religion. He could not help but feel excited and kept puffing white mist. The cursing and praying of the noodle shop owner continued, but Sang Sang's face showed no expression. She turned to look at the ruffians. The ruffians were smashing things and one of them was holding a kitchen knife. He was waving it randomly and he kept cursing and looking very excited. F***CKU even Hao Yin can't save you today? This is the 2nd chapter. It was really hard to write so it was late. There is still the 3rd chapter. I will continue to write and try to finish it earlier, but it may be difficult. Anyway, I will sleep after finishing. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com and vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 838. Because he was too excited, the ruffian did not pay attention to his feet. He stepped on a piece of ice and slid down. The kitchen knife in his hand slid across the thigh of one of his companions, and then cut the thick bamboo used to support the noodle stall. Perhaps because he fell too hard or because the knife was too fast, there was a big wound on the thigh of his companion. Blood gushed out, and the thick bamboo was cut in the middle, piercing into the chest of another ruffian. It was a mess. When people came to their senses, they found that the 3 ruffians were all dead. A ruffian's entire body was covered in his own blood, another ruffian's chest was pierced through, and the ruffian holding the knife accidentally injured his abdomen in the chaos, his intestines flowing all over the ground. It was a very bloody scene and a very shocking change. Whether it was the onlookers or the father and daughter of the noodle stall, they all looked extremely pale and could not come to their senses. "Cook noodles for me?" Sang Sang looked at the stall owner and then frowned slightly. She found that not only the coriander was missing, but even the chili oil had been spilled. She suddenly lost interest in eating noodles, and led the big black horse away from the noodle stall. She walked to the man selling sesame seed cake across the street, and wanted to buy 2 pieces, but she did not know why she changed her mind. At this moment she heard the discussion coming from the noodle stall. People praised heaven for having eyes, and said that they would testify for the father and daughter, and that it was a miracle of Haotian. Someone also mentioned the Taoist temple outside the county, and asked the father and daughter to go to the Taoist temple to fulfill their vows, saying that the Taoist knew there was a really kind person. Then a woman sighed, saying that good people did not have a good life, and that the Taoist knew was dying. Sang Sang led the big black horse out of the county, and found the Taoist temple that was not shabby but obviously a little shabby. Her indifferent eyes looked through the courtyard wall, and saw the dying old Taoist. The old Taoist was very thin and his body was covered with abscesses. A middle-aged Taoist who was going to take over the Taoist temple stood at the door with some disgust, and those who had received help from the Taoist temple in the past were serving him by the side, bearing the stench. She watched quietly for a while and then turned to leave. Not long after she left, a strange fragrance suddenly appeared in the simple and crude Taoist temple. Then golden flowers fell from the old beams and sprinkled on the old Taoist. The abscesses on the old Taoist's face shrunk at a speed visible to the naked eye, and then disappeared. His withered white hair suddenly became incomparably black. Not only did he recover from his illness, but he also looked 10 years younger. The middle-aged Taoist was extremely shocked. The Haotian believers in the room had already knelt on the ground, kowtowing and praying to the sky, thanking Haotian for his blessings. The old Taoist sat up with difficulty with the help of the others. He thought about how he had devoted his life to the way and helped the people of the world. Finally he was rewarded. He raised his hands to the sky and cried, "God loves the world." A few miles southwest of the Taoist temple, Sang Sang led the big black horse and walked in the woods. The big black horse looked at her back with confusion in its eyes. It could not understand why she was doing these 2 things. It remembered that Ning Ke had once said that heaven's way was invisible and ruthless. The people and believers of the human world should be like ants in her eyes. Then why did she care about these things? Sang Sang met a family deep in the mountains. There were 14 people in the family, old and young. They made a living by burning charcoal. They lived a hard life, but they lived a peaceful and happy life. No one knew that the old man of the family used to be a low-level deacon in the devil's doctrine. After the devil's doctrine was destroyed, he escaped into the mountains and married a local woman. However, he could not forget his family background. When his children grew up, he began to teach them the skills of the devil's doctrine. Those skills were naturally not advanced and they were useless in the mountains and forests. The old man just wanted to find peace of mind. After Sang Sang left, the charcoal kiln suddenly collapsed and ignited the dry firewood in the yard. The fierce fire burned the family into snow-white ashes. It was for purification. The big black horse followed behind her and looked at her bare white feet. It thought that if one said that not having shoes was naive, then Ning Ke was right. Naivety was cruelty. God loved the world and only loved the world she wanted to love. Haotian was still ruthless. In the middle of winter, Sang Sang led the big black horse to the capital of the Kingdom of Song. She passed through the busy streets and came to an inconspicuous restaurant. She suddenly felt very hungry. The wine was enough for her to walk in the human world for a long time. The feeling of hunger had nothing to do with her body. It was a psychological feeling. She hated and gradually became wary of this feeling. However, she still walked into the small restaurant and walked up to the quiet 3rd floor. She ordered 18 dishes without a menu and a plate of iced sweet mashed taro. She had been to this restaurant before. She remembered the names of the dishes and the desserts. Everything was exactly the same as the last time she came. It did not take long before the iced mashed taro was served. Then, 18 plates of hot and cold meat and vegetable dishes were also served, filling the table in front of her. Sang Sang did not pick up the chopsticks. She looked at the dishes on the table for a long time. Then she remembered what the man said to her in the restaurant last time. "You have to try this dish. Poor girl, you haven't had a good life with Ning Ke all these years. You have to know that there are so many delicious and fun things in the human world. You should follow me and enjoy life these days." She slowly closed her eyes and remembered what the man said to her by the Sisui River. "I took you to eat the best roasted lamb leg in the world and the most exquisite 18 plates in the Kingdom of Song. I took you to eat the most delicious instant boiled mutton in the grassland. I took you to eat peony fish and oyster soup. I took you to see the snow-capped peak and went boating on the sea. I even let you and Ning Ke get married. I took you to eat all kinds of delicious food in the human world. I took you to enjoy all kinds of beautiful sceneries in the human world. I let you experience the greatest happiness of being a human. I even let you experience a deeper feeling. In your eyes, humans are just ants. Now that you've married an ant and you've experienced the beauty of it, you've fully experienced the beauty of the human world. So, do you have the slightest desire to stay in the human world? All these years, you have tried everything to find me and invite me to fight in heaven. But have you ever thought that I also want to invite you to be a guest in the human world? She opened her eyes. There was no emotion in her eyes. All of a sudden, a heavy snowstorm fell from the sky and covered the capital of the Kingdom of Song. Screams and people running away came from the streets. The railings of the restaurants were instantly covered with snow. It was very cold. She was angry, so the snowstorm fell from the sky. She woke up in the broken peak. When she walked to the sea of snow, she took a look at the peony fish. At first she walked 1,000 miles in one step, but then she began to slow down. The drunkard could not avoid her, not because she was fast enough, but because she was the rule. No matter what the drunkard did, they were all hers. The reason why she slowed down was that her aura began to become turbid and heavy as she walked. She walked in the human world and began to blend into it. She looked at her plump body and understood what was added to it. It was the human power that the man left in her body. It was the beauty of the human world that the man had brought her to experience. Those, low-level but stubborn auras. Looking at the 18 dishes on the table, she slowly picked up the chopsticks and began to eat. She ate very fast, even faster than the man. A moment later, all 18 dishes were in her stomach, and the iced mashed taro was also eaten up. The snow in the capital of the Kingdom of Song stopped. She walked out of the restaurant and led the big black horse to the street. The street became lively again. Children were making snowmen and some were preparing for snowball fights. A vendor took the opportunity to shout, "Sugar-coated haws." She saw the Chinjinji cosmetic store not far away and remembered that the man had bought her a box of cosmetic powder. Later he bought another box in the city called Chang'an. Her expression became more and more serious, and the emotion in her eyes became more and more faint. People came and went. She stood in the middle of the street, holding the reins with her hands behind her back, proud and lonely. She did not look at the sky because she was the sky. She looked at the human world. She could not go back, nor could she go forward. She did not allow herself to step into the human world again. This was the trap that the man set for her before he ascended to the sky, or the question he asked her. How to solve the trap? How to solve the problem? Even if she was omnipotent, she still needed time to solve such a big problem. Her expression became more and more indifferent, and her eyes were so faint that they seemed to be transparent. Not far away came the sound of someone drinking a sesame seed cake. She found that she was hungry again. She had not eaten sesame seed cake in that county. She was angry about this situation, and decided to kill everyone in the capital. Suddenly she felt something wet and soft touch the back of her hand. She looked back. Her black hair floated up, and a piece of snow was broken into the finest particles by her hair. The big black horse bent its front hooves as if it was kneeling humbly. In the cold weather, the sweat in its mane kept steaming. It was obviously extremely nervous. When Sang Sang's eyes fell on it, it became even more nervous. It hesitated for a moment, and carefully licked the back of her hand again. Sang Sang looked at it quietly. The big black horse wagged its tail desperately, showing a pitiful expression. The peddler carrying the sesame seed cake was very short. As he passed by, he kept shouting, completely unaware that he had just brushed shoulders with death. Sang Sang looked at the big black horse and asked, "Aren't you afraid of death?" The big black horse wanted to bury its head in the snow, and was filled with endless regret. She turned to look at the long street and then at the human world again. But at this time, the coldness in her eyes faded. The big black horse raised its head and looked at her back, feeling much happier. The short vendor carried the sesame seed cake and ran to the other end of the street. There was a beautiful young woman waiting for him there. The two talked and walked home. The short vendor was a little proud and self-abased, and did not dare to look at the passers-by. The young woman kept greeting her neighbors. Sang Sang looked over there and said, "The love and hate of human beings are so lowly and ridiculous, but they hypocritically regard it as a belief. Why should you love such people?" The big black horse lowered its head, not daring to object, but it did not agree with her. Done in 3 chapters. There is a separate chapter below. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 839. That woman was born beautiful, but she wasn't willing to be a servant or a concubine. She saved up money for many years, sold her personal jewelry to redeem herself, and then married this man who made sesame seed cakes. She even used her savings to buy a house on the street. After marriage, the man went out to sell sesame cakes every day, while she did needlework and housework at home. Although they lived a hard life, it was still peaceful. They shared joys and sorrows and never left each other. Thinking of these things at night, the woman admired herself. Sang Sang knew what the big black horse was thinking. She looked at the couple on the street and said. The big black horse swayed his ponytail and thought, "Isn't this a wonderful thing?" She continued, "Humans are always greedy, there will always be times when their desires are not satisfied, they will always want more from this world, thinking that they deserve more. One day the woman will despise her man for being short and boring, so she will start to mock and ridicule him. The man will feel guilty, so he won't dare to retort, instead he will become even more humble, and in the eyes of the woman he will become even more boring. Her heart will become somewhat irritated and unhappy, and one day when she closes the curtains, the pole in her hand will fall onto the street, hitting a handsome and rich young master. When the young master sees the flesh under her skirt, his heart will begin to itch, and the woman will also begin to itching to the same place. In the future, when the adultery is discovered, the woman will be ashamed, afraid and ashamed, and will naturally have evil intentions in her heart. How would she remember the solemn vows of eternal love, the peaceful times, and only think of using all means possible to kill the short man selling sesame seed cakes, so that she can happily spend time with her lover? The wind and snow had stopped and the snow on the eaves of the houses began to melt. As the sun moved to the west, the temperature dropped and the water dripping from the eaves was frozen into icicles. Her words were like the icicles. They seemed transparent and emotionless, but in fact they were extremely cold. They tore apart the beautiful coat of life and revealed the cruelty under the hypocrisy. The big black horse stopped wagging his tail and looked down at the snow on the street. He felt cold and knew that she could see everything. The coldness was probably the truth of the world. Sang Sang put her hands behind her back and held the reins. She walked to the street. When she passed by a house, she was suddenly called. The short man who sold sesame cakes, with a cloth bag in his hand, looked at her and hesitated. He wanted to say something, but he was too nervous to say anything for a long time. Sang Sang glanced at him expressionlessly and prepared to leave. The beautiful woman squeezed through the doors and took the cloth bag from the short man's hand. She looked at her and said with a cheerful smile, "Young lady, don't be afraid. We are not bad people. It's just that my husband saw you walking barefoot in the snow and felt a little sorry for you, so he wanted to give you a pair. Ordinary cloth shoes, I made them myself. Of course my needlework isn't good, but it's still sturdy. Don't stand on ceremony." After saying that, the beautiful woman stuffed the cloth bag in her hand into Sang Sang's hand and pulled the dwarf back into the house. No one knew what she did, but the dwarf begged for mercy with a smile. Sang Sang looked at the cloth bag in her hand and was silent for a while. Then she threw the cloth bag into the snow beside the street and walked on with her hands behind her back. The big black horse felt it was a pity. A great aunt next door saw a young man walking across the street and greeted him with a smile. "Sir, where are you going? Do you want to have a cup of tea?" The young man was handsome and had an extraordinary spirit, especially his eyes, which seemed to be able to speak. The most pleasing thing was that he was amiable, and even when talking to the great aunt he was extremely gentle. Sang Sang did not care about these stories and walked out of the capital. The young man exchanged a few words with the great aunt and was about to have a cup of hot tea. Unexpectedly, when he walked up the stone steps, several icicles hanging from the eaves suddenly broke and fell to the ground. With a few sounds, his chest and abdomen were directly pierced by the icicles, and he died just like that. Suddenly there were countless exclamations on the street. Walking out of the capital of the kingdom of Song, Sang Sang led the big black horse and looked somewhere in the southwest direction. Her face was as white as the moon, but there were countless fine lights emerging and then destroyed in the depths of her eyes. It was like countless knives appearing in the wind and snow. The wind and snow were like knives, and when they fell on people's faces, they would leave deep marks. Chin Pippi covered his face with an old cloth and walked with difficulty in the wind and snow with his head down. From time to time he would look back at the handcart behind him to make sure that his father, who was lying in the carriage, was safe and that the quilt covering him had not been lifted by the wind. It had been a few days since he left Chang'an. He did not know where the violent black wind had gone, but it had rushed into the wind and snow again. Because of the war, this village had been fortified, and there was no food to be found. It was even more impossible to find a horse carriage. He only found a somewhat broken handcart. When he walked into a forest, the wind and snow gradually subsided. Chin Pippi stopped the handcart under a big tree. He did not stop to rest, but dug a stove and began to cook porridge and medicine. When the medicine was ready, he walked to the side of the carriage, lifted the leather mattress off his father's face, and began to feed him medicine. The invincible Abbey Dean of Jisho Abbey was now just an old man who was seriously injured and on the verge of death. But the expression in his eyes was still so calm, and there was no expression on his face. In the shocking battle in Chang'an, he was finally defeated by the character written by Ning Kei, and his body was cut by thousands of knives. The most terrifying thing was that the knife intent was mixed with the aura of the human world like dirty ink and mixed into his wounds. No matter how he washed it, it could not be washed away even with the West Hill divine skill. Chin Pippi let him take the last heavenly power pill, but it could only temporarily prolong his life, and could not make his injuries better. He was very silent along the way even when he was feeding medicine because he was seriously injured and could not speak, and because they had not seen each other for many years. It was a very strange relationship between father and son. After feeding medicine to his father, Chin Pippi tucked the corner of the mattress, and then sat in the snow pile beside the carriage. He held a big bowl of hot porridge and began to eat. Although the snow had stopped, the cold wind was still raging. The snow on the trees was blown off by the wind, falling on the cart and also into his bowl. He looked at the falling snow and suddenly had an idea to speak. "You know that the headmaster is right, so why do you insist on this path?" Hearing that he finally spoke, Chin Pippi smiled and said, "Which path am I taking?" Chin Pippi knocked on the edge of the bowl with his chopsticks and said, "You are a man of great wisdom, and you should be very clear that humans and Haotian will eventually be irreconcilable. Whether it is the everlasting night or others, the human world will eventually face destruction. Then why do you still stand on Haotian's side? Faith is not a reasonable explanation." For countless years, there were only 8 grand cultivators who had cultivated to Chin Pippi's state. At this state, it was naturally difficult to say that there was any devout faith, and this was what Chin Pippi did not understand. Chin Pippi said, "The choice has nothing to do with faith, only with reason. The headmaster and Kuhauran think that humans and Haotian are opposite, but from the perspective of Haotian Taoism, humans and Haotian are mutually dependent." Chin Pippi said, "Don't you feel bored in a closed world?" Chin Pippi said, "Haotian Taoism thinks that solemnity and stability are eternal beauty, and the Buddhism sect thinks that the cycle and samsara are a kind of cause and effect. There must be an end when there is a beginning, and such a process is a complete process. If the headmaster wants to break this completeness, he will be further and further away from eternity." Chin Pippi said, "Even if there is no self-consciousness in eternity?" Chin Pippi said, "Nirvana is eternity and we will return to where we came from. In that world, you and I are Haotian and Haotian is you and me, so why should we be divided? Since there was no you and I in this world before we were born, then there should not be you and me in the end. This is my reason or my belief, and it has nothing to do with right or wrong. Your headmaster may not be wrong, but in my opinion he is. Since this is the case, we naturally cannot be on the same path." At this moment, there was a slow sound of hooves coming from the forest. Chin Pippi held the bowl of porridge and looked back. He saw a bleak scene behind the forest. The wind and snow had stopped, but it was not clear yet. A woman led a black horse through the forest and hit the leaves. He naturally recognized the big black horse, but he did not recognize the woman leading it. He looked at the big black horse, but the big black horse did not dare to look at him. It timidly lowered its head and lightly kicked its front hooves. Chin Pippi looked at the woman and felt that she looked ordinary, but faintly exuded an indescribable aura. Then he saw something familiar on the woman's face. He was shocked. He looked at her slightly round waist and said, "How did you get so fat?" Sang Sang did not answer his question. He remembered that Sang Sang was no longer Sang Sang, so he laughed at himself and said, "I really have no right to say this, not because of who you are, but because I am a fat man." He used to be the most devout believer of Haotian. However, after years of studying in the back of the mountain of the academy and being influenced by the headmaster of the academy, there were many people in his life who were not accepted by Haotian Taoism, like Ning Kei and Tang Xiaotang. His belief and attitude towards Haotian had changed a lot. If it were 5 years ago, he would have knelt in front of her at this time. But now, he stood so casually in front of her, and did not even put down the bowl of porridge in his hand. For him now, Haotian was not necessarily more important than a bowl of porridge. He said sadly, "Now that I think about it, second brother and I have really made a big mistake. Back in the back of the mountain of the academy, Eldest brother always had some kind of vigilance towards Sang Sang, while Jun Imo and Chin Pippi became her strongest supporters after seeing Sang Sang's ashes. The headmaster of the academy would leave by the Sisui River because of Sang Sang in the human world. It was naturally impossible to say that Jun Imo and he did not have a trace of regret in their hearts. Although we often can't make up for our mistakes and we may not have the ability to make up for them, we have to try once in our lives so that we can feel at ease. Chin Pippi looked at her and said seriously, with an admirable smile on his slightly chubby face. He put the chopsticks on the porridge bowl and pointed at it from afar. With the natural stream magical finger of the Academy's no-boundary spirit, leaves suddenly fell from the forest, and snow rolled up into a snow line, coming from an unpredictable place and stabbing at her face. There is one more chapter. It will definitely be very late, or it will be written at 6 or 7 in the morning. You can all get up and read it tomorrow. I'm working hard on it. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for it. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 840. Sang Sang didn't move, but the whole forest seemed to be moving. The whole world seemed to be moving, or more precisely, the space was moving. So the snow line flew past her body and then fell on the soft snow. But it seemed to fall on a mirror and was reflected back into Chin Pippi's body. Chin Pippi's face was slightly pale. There was a bloody hole on his shoulder which was caused by his natural stream finger. He looked at Sang Sang with a touch of bitterness and emotion. This bitterness had nothing to do with the gap in their realms. He had never thought that he could defeat her. This was her world. It was natural that he could not hurt her. If he could hurt her, it would be incomprehensible. He was a little sad at this time because he remembered the first day of the new year several years ago. At that time, Sang Sang was still a skinny black girl. She held a thick quilt and stood silently and stubbornly in the Chang'an local government, looking so pitiful. At that time he performed the natural stream magical finger for the first time to protect her. Sang Sang looked at Chin Pippi quietly. Since she came to the human world, Chin Pippi was the first person who dared to attack her. Even the drunkard dared to run away and the butcher could only squat in the corner and cry. Strangely, she didn't punish Chin Pippi for his disrespect to Haotian. Instead, she turned to the direction of Chang'an and said without any emotion, "You refused me there." She looked at Chang'an and said to Chin Mao in the handcart. She was talking about how the Abbey Dean entered Chang'an alone a few days ago and used the state of pureness. Chin Mao didn't explain but smiled strangely. There were many emotions in his smile. There was the joy of seeing the shore, the relief of seeing through everything, and the calmness of looking at the clouds. But there was no awe. This was the first time he saw Haotian. She was so proud and indifferent without any human emotion. But in his eyes she was so interesting. He vaguely understood the changes in her. He wanted to praise the headmaster who had left the human world. He knew that no one could see the direction of the world. Not even Haotian. Although the West Hill Divine Kingdom was much warmer than Tang and Yin, it was still spring and the temperature was not too high. The wind blowing in the mountains was still a little chilly. The green trees in the mountains were covered with winter dust, revealing a sense of lifelessness. Looking up, there was not a single wildflower in the mountains. The atmosphere on Peach Mountain was tense and depressing. The war against the Tang Empire was not going well. Even the great divine priest of Revelation and the world wayfarer Yi Su were seriously injured. The coalition army of the Divine Hall could not advance a single step in front of the Verdant Canyon. The Hierarch Lord did not show up again after returning from Chang'an. There were not many people left in the Divine Hall to begin with. Because of these things, they kept quiet out of fear and did not dare to casually walk out of the hall. Perhaps for this reason, when the tall and fat girl in indigo arrived at the foot of Peach Mountain with the big black horse that had been registered by the Divine Hall, no one noticed them. For some reason, Sang Sang came to the West Hill Divine Palace instead of Chang'an. She led the big black horse and walked among the green mountains. She looked calm and natural as if she was patrolling her own territory. She led the big black horse into the Divine Hall of Revelation. The inside of the Divine Hall was spacious and quiet. The big black horse's 4 hooves stepped on the jade-like floor, making a crisp and pleasant sound. The great divine priest of Revelation lay on the bed in the deepest part of the Divine Hall. The dim light shone from the top of the hall and fell on his face, making his wrinkles appear deeper. He looked so old that he seemed to be dying at any moment. In front of the Verdant Canyon, he was knocked down by the eldest brother of the academy with a stick. His sacred sedan was burned to ashes, and his old body was about to turn into ashes. As the great divine priest of Revelation who could see the future of Haotian Taoism, He naturally knew how serious his injuries were. After being sent back to the Divine Hall, he did not do anything. He even drove Qing Lixue and other deacons of the Revelation Department out of the Divine Hall. He calmly waited for the day to return to Hao Yan's Divine Kingdom. This Divine Hall had been dark and quiet for a long time. No one dared to disturb the great Divine Priest's peace before his death. At this time there was a sudden sound of hooves. The great Divine Priest of Revelation opened his eyes with difficulty and looked over. He saw the big black horse and the girl holding the reins. At a glance he understood many things. His withered eyes glowed again and his wrinkles became more relaxed. Then he revealed the most sincere and happy smile. Sang Sang walked to the bed and looked at him quietly. She was sure that this human had reached the end of his life. Even she could not let him stay in the human world any longer. She could only let him stay a little longer. The great Divine Priest of Revelation sensed her thoughts and said humbly and sincerely, "To be able to return to your arms is the biggest wish of my life. Please fulfill it." Sang Sang sat on the bed and reached out to hold the skinny old man in her arms, as if she was holding a baby. There was still no emotion on her face, but she began to emit a calm aura. The great Divine Priest of Revelation leaned his head weakly on her shoulder and murmured, "You came back a little late." He had met her in the old brush pen shop in Chang'an. 3 years later he saw the light on the Peach Mountain. Therefore he made a promise with her in 3 years. That was the 15th year of the Tianqi era of the Tang Empire. Now it was the first year of the Tang Empire. 4 years had passed unknowingly. Sang Sang said emotionlessly, "Playing with time is really not fun." The great Divine Priest of Revelation revealed a calm smile on his face and then closed his eyes. Sang Sang confirmed that the human soul had returned to the Divine Kingdom and put his body back on the bed. Then she stood up and led the big black horse out of the Divine Hall. She did not leave the Peach Mountain. She went to the highest white Divine Hall on the Peach Mountain. After the Hierarch Lord returned to the West Hill Divine Palace, he became extremely irritable. His thunder-like roars could often be heard on the Peach Mountain. Those trusted followers were even more afraid to step into the Divine Hall. When Sang Sang led the big black horse to the white Divine Hall, there were more than a dozen divine priests kneeling in front of the hall. Those divine priests heard the noise and were about to scold them, but suddenly found that they could not speak. From this moment on, these respected divine priests of West Hill could not speak anymore. Even if they picked up a pen, they could not write words that matched their thoughts. They had lost all the ability to express themselves. Sang Sang led the big black horse into the Divine Hall. There were thousands of layers of gauze in the depths of the Divine Hall. Thousands of beams of light reflected a tall figure. It was the figure of the hierarch of the West Hill Divine Palace. Although Sang Sang was very tall now, she was so small compared to that figure. The tall figure suddenly trembled, and so did the voice through the gauze. "You are not Lin Wu. Who are you?" Sang Sang continued to walk forward expressionlessly. With every step she took, she became taller. Compared with her, the tall figure behind the gauze became smaller and smaller. She walked into the gauze and into the thousands of beams of light, and no light spilled out. The hierarch knelt at her feet and kept kissing the ground in front of her bare feet. He said humbly, "Your most loyal servant in the world welcomes your arrival." He was seriously injured, blind, and had a broken hand. He was even thinner and more miserable than when he was at the back of the mountain of the academy. She looked at the skinny dwarf at her feet and suddenly remembered a sentence. It was a sentence she had heard many years ago in the mountain range that she had abandoned. "Look at that person. He looks like a dog." She was omniscient and omnipotent. But until today she still could not understand why the guy would laugh so happily and shed tears after saying that. She frowned slightly, and a holy flame appeared in the depths of her black eyes. The hierarch began to howl in pain. His eyes, which had been pierced by Yu Lian's cicada wings, began to burn. After a while, the flame was extinguished and a smear of ash fell from his eyes. He looked at the clear world in front of him, wept bitterly and kowtowed repeatedly. Sang Sang stopped looking at him and walked out with the black horse. She glanced at the dark and solemn Divine Hall and walked to the Divine Hall of Light. There was a lamp in the Divine Hall of Light. Whether the former great Divine Priest of Light was imprisoned or the throne was empty, the lamp was always on. It was the symbol of the Divine Hall. It was a cold early spring day in the 3450th year of Daji of West Hill. The great Divine Priest of Revelation returned to Hao Yan's Divine Kingdom. The lamp in the Divine Hall of Light was extinguished because someone walked into the Divine Hall. She was the light and did not need a symbol. The wildflowers in the mountains around the Divine Hall of West Hill suddenly bloomed, which attracted many surprised gazes. Although the West Hill was warm, there was still a long time before the flowering period. Something even more shocking happened. Decades ago, the headmaster of Academy went to the peach mountain and cut off all the peach blossoms. Since then, the peach blossoms never bloomed again. But today there were countless peach blossoms all over the mountain. This chapter is 200 or 300 words away from 300. It can be written anyway. But the plot is cut off here. It is meaningless to force it into it. I want to report it to everyone. This part of Song Song's plot is my favorite and the one I want to write the most. The 2 chapters of I Love the World refer to her and the big black horse. I like the part where she hugged the great divine priest of revelation and waited for him to die. When I write it, I suddenly think of Fan Xian hugging Qin Pingping. Of course, these are 2 completely different feelings. I wanted to name this chapter Mother and Son or Master and Servant, but the peach blossoms are more beautiful. Song Song's chapter is temporarily over. Tomorrow I will write the story of her man. I will continue to ask for monthly votes. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 841. It was not hot in Chang and in the early summer, but there were already ice basins in the backyard of the rich. The cold wind lingered in the room as if it was winter. However, old Master Chu's shirt remained unbuttoned. He was sweating profusely as he constantly fanned himself. He appeared extremely hot. He could not help but feel nervous after hearing the news. His heart began to heat up. Is it true? Is it true? He stared at Chu Yuxian and asked in a low voice, looking very mysterious. If it's not convenient for you to tell me, just blink your eyes. Chu Yuxian looked at his father and sighed helplessly. He held his forehead and did not know how to answer. Although the news had been spreading in the house for the past 2 days, he could not admit it. Looking at his reaction, Master Chu knew that it was probably true. The wrinkles on his face suddenly smoothed out. He laughed and patted Chu Yuxian's shoulder excitedly, saying, "No wonder it's hard to see you at home these days. I didn't see you in the House of Red Sleeves either. I thought it was impossible for you to turn over a new leaf. It turns out that you have become an official. Not bad, not bad. I was right to spend so much money to send you to the academy." Master Chu was a famous rich man in Chang'an. What he hoped most in his life was that his son could make a name for himself in the officialdom. According to the news, although Chu Yuxian's position was not high, it was very important and could be regarded as the confidant of the imperial court. Now that it was confirmed, he was very happy. He looked at Chu Yuxian and said seriously, "Your performance in the academy is a mess, and your ability to handle affairs is not outstanding. You should know that you can get to this position because of Mr. 13's old friendship. You can't let him down. Be careful with your words and don't be too complacent." Chu Yuxian finally could not stand it anymore after hearing this. He waved his arms and shouted angrily, "Who is complacent? Who is complacent? I'm a secret guard and I can't let anyone know about it. You had to spend thousands of taels of silver to hire someone to investigate me. Now you found out. Do you think I can still be a secret guard? Do you have to spend tens of thousands of taels of silver to shut everyone's mouth? I don't understand. It was supposed to be a good thing. Why did you make it so troublesome?" Master Qin was scolded by his son, but he couldn't retort, because he really didn't think things through. His face turned green and red and he said, "I won't care about you anymore, okay?" Chu Yuxian stood up and was about to leave angrily. Old Master Jin saw that this brat actually didn't appreciate his humility, and he couldn't help but feel a little angry. He shouted, "Don't think that just because you are a trusted aide of the imperial court, I won't dare to beat you up. At a time like this, why go out and have fun?" Chu Yuxian said, "There's a party at the House of Red Sleeves tonight. I have to go." "I haven't been there for 10 days, what right do you have to go?" Chu Yuxian said angrily, "If you don't let me go, I won't go." Master Chu wanted to say, "So what if I don't go?" Suddenly, he remembered that Mr. 13 was his son's classmate, so he couldn't bring himself to say it. He said, "Go early and come back early." In the early summer, the city of Chang'an was covered with green trees. Even from a long distance, there was a large patch of green, which made people feel very comfortable. However, no matter how beautiful the scenery was, if one looked at it for a long time, one would get tired of it. For example, the headmaster of the academy had been looking at the vast world for thousands of years, and he always wanted to go somewhere else. Another example was the empress, who had lived in this city for decades, and because no one accompanied her, she also grew tired. Standing on the city wall, Ning Ke looked at the mountains and lakes in the city, and naturally thought of these 2 people. Then he thought of what Yi Hongyu said by the Yanming Lake. You will be trapped in Chang'an for the rest of your life, and you will be an angry prisoner. Except for the Qingming festival, he hadn't left Chang'an for many days. He began to get tired of it, and there was still a long way to go before he was angry. But he knew that he had indeed become a prisoner. There was a warm wind blowing on the city wall. Early summer, like late spring, was the warmest and most beautiful season in Chang'an. However, eldest brother still did not take off his old cotton-padded jacket. Ning Ke was very sure that eldest brother's cotton-padded jacket had not been washed since the day he first met eldest brother in the spring of the 13th year of the Tianqi era. He was always covered with dust, but why did he still feel so clean? If the heart is clean, the body will naturally be clean, eldest brother said slowly. Ning Ke smiled and said, I have only heard of the saying if the heart is calm, the body will naturally be clean, but I have never heard of the saying if the heart is calm, the body will naturally be clean. Senior brother, don't you think this is very unreasonable? Eldest brother walked slowly to his side, looked at the streets under the city wall, and said, if the heart is calm, the body will naturally be clean. This sentence is very interesting, but it is a pity that your heart can't calm down. If the heart could be really calm, then even if he was trapped in prison he could still gallop between heaven and earth. Ning Ke understood what eldest brother meant, but under the current situation he could not calm down. Eldest brother looked at him with pity and said, since you can't calm down, then move a little. Ning Ke thought for a while and said, it is too risky. Eldest brother said, the God-stunning array is still here and I can also leave. Even if there is danger, I believe that I can also resist for a while. We can't let you really waste your time here. Ning Ke pointed at the pedestrians in the streets and said, their lives and future are all on my shoulders. What right do I have to take the risk with them? Eldest brother said, now you are guarding this city and its people, but if you can't walk out of this city, then this city and its people will be guarding you. Ning Ke was silent for a long time and then said, I understand. Eldest brother said, according to the method we have thought of a few days ago, it is okay to move a little. Junimo and I are not worried about Chang'an, but what we may encounter on the road. Ning Ke said, if fourth brother's calculation is correct, even if we encounter something we can solve it. Now we need to confirm the news from the West Hill Divine Palace. Eldest brother asked, when can we confirm it? Ning Ke was silent for a while and said, it may never be confirmed. I want to get more information before making a decision. If I really do this, I will still have to trouble you, senior brother. Eldest brother said gently, then you can take a look. I will leave first. Ning Ke asked, senior brother, are you going back to the palace? Eldest brother said, there is something wrong with the Longwei River dike. The officials of the Ministry of Works and the Ministry of Revenue are quarreling in the hall. His Majesty and Li Yu are still waiting for me to go back and make a decision. Ning Ke asked seriously, senior brother, is there anything you can't do? Eldest brother smiled and said, I don't know talisman Taoism, or I would be a prisoner of this city. But if I were to be imprisoned in Chang'an, I think I would not have any objection. After eldest brother returned to the palace, Ning Ke stayed on the city wall for a while. He watched the sun gradually sink to the west, and the sunset glow illuminated the city wall of Chang'an. Then he saw the city wall turn into a sea of flowers. Thousands of Tang soldiers walked into Chang'an city, welcomed by the warm waving of the people and the scattering of flowers. They belonged to the Northern Battlefront Army and suffered the most in this war. And because of the pressure exerted by the Golden Palace, they could not return to Chang'an until early summer to receive their rewards. Ning Ke walked down the city wall and walked to the House of Red Sleeves. Tonight, the House of Red Sleeves was booked to hold the classmates' reunion of the academy in the 13th year of Tianqi era. Ning Ke stood by the window and looked at the young generals downstairs who kept drinking and the new officials in various departments. He saw Chu Zhongtian, who was bearded and no longer looked young. He saw Wang Ying of Linchuan, who was very popular in the Hanlin Academy. He saw Chen Ximiao, He Yingqin, and Chen Zixian and other classmates from classroom 3. Situ Ilan and Jean Wuxia sat by the table hand in hand and were whispering stories after they parted. Looking at his back, Situ Ilan asked, you really don't want to go down? Ning Ke shook his head, walked to the table and sat down. It was indeed inconvenient for him to go downstairs because of his current status, and there was no need to deliberately make those gestures. In this single room there were only him, Chu Yuxian, and the two familiar girls. After the mourning period, Jean Wuxia married a young official of the Ministry of Works. Looking at her gentle expression, she should be very happy after marriage. but it was unknown whether she sometimes thought of a man named Xie Qingyun. Situ Ilan had been in the army all these years. Since last year, she had been fighting against the cavalry of the Golden Tribe Royal Court at the front line of the northern borderline. Today she had just returned to Chang'an. The most important reason for holding this reunion was to wait for her return. Chu Yuxian drank a few cups of wine with her. Seeing that Situ Ilan seemed to want to talk to Ning Ke alone, he winked at Jin Wuxia and they went downstairs. Situ Ilan looked into Ning Ke's eyes and said, "It's said that it was the prince's idea to cede the Xiangwan plain. If he dies, so does the empress. Even the soldiers in the northern battlefront army can't be angry. But I know that it must be approved by the academy." She had changed into casual clothes. Although she was a little tanned after being exposed to the wind and sun in the northern borderline, she was still beautiful. But the cloth wrapped around her head looked a little weird. Ning Ke looked at her and said, "I know what you want to ask. Yes, ceding the Xiangwan plain to the Golden Palace and Dongshan Commandery to the Yin Kingdom was approved by the academy, or more precisely by me." Situ Ilan asked, "Why? If ceding Dongshan Commandery was just a temporary show of weakness, why cede the Xiangwan plain? You should know how important that pasture is to the Tang Empire." Ning Ke said, "You can probably guess that something happened and the academy had to retreat temporarily." Situ Ilan said, "The cavalry of the Golden Palace is really strong. Many of us died there. I feel a little uneasy when I think they may become stronger." Ning Ke said, "I will kill them all. Don't worry." Situ Ilan trusted him. Although she knew that no cultivator could destroy the entire Golden Palace, she was not worried anymore because it was the academy's promise. She noticed that Ning Ke kept staring at a certain part of her body. She asked with a smile, "Are you curious?" Ning Ke nodded. She pulled off the cloth. It turned out that the waterfall-like hair of the past had already become short and messy. Note: the part about Chu Yuxian was inspired by a student's comment in the book review section. I was looking for a starting point for the plot at that time. Thank you. I will try to finish the next chapter before 1 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 842. It's not convenient to keep long hair in the military camp, mainly because it's inconvenient to wash it after being stained with blood, so I just cut it off. Speaking of which, it's a lot darker and there are a lot of scars. It's so ugly. Situ Ilan rubbed her hair and said helplessly. Although she had changed a lot in the military camp, everyone loved beauty, not to mention that she was a woman after all. Ning Ke looked at her playful appearance and felt very gentle. He said, "In my eyes, you are the most beautiful now, more beautiful than ever before." Situ Ilan said, "You don't have to say such words to make me happy." Ning Ke smiled and did not explain. He said, "What are you going to do next?" Situ Ilan said, "The military ministry is going to send me to Gushin Commandery." As soon as she said this, the room became much quieter. Ning Ke knew the intention of the imperial court to send her to Gushin Commandery. It was to use General Yunhui's prestige in the army to divide and conquer the Hua family's power in the army. After all, Hua Shangyue was dead. Liu was very grateful to the Hua family and had to do this work. Situ Ilan returned from the northern borderline and knew more about the inside story of Hua Shanyue's death than anyone else. She knew that Ning Ke had something to do with it, but she did not say anything. Instead she said, "I want to see Her Highness." "She doesn't want to see you?" Ning Ke was a little surprised. With the status of General Yunhui's mansion and the relationship between Situ Ilan and Liu, it should be very easy for her to see the palace. Situ Ilan nodded. Ning Ke did not expect that Liu was more autistic than he imagined. After a moment of silence he said, "I'll give you an ID token. You go to the palace by yourself at night and talk to her more." It was a gathering of the academy's classmates, and in this situation, naturally there were no dancers to accompany them. But the scene was still very lively. Ning Ke went to the top floor to see Mistress Jian. Dewdrop made a bowl of glutinous rice balls and placed it on the table in front of him. Then she naturally sat beside him and held his arm. Even when Mistress Jian frowned slightly, she still smiled and refused to let go. She had long been removed from the register, but she was still used to living in the building. Naturally, she was not as respectful to Mistress Jian as she was in the past. However, Ning Ke could only take the comfort of her warmth as a test. Xiao Chao stood behind Mistress Jian and snorted angrily. As time went by, the little girl had grown up, especially after Mistress Jian handed over the management of the song and dance troupe to her. She had matured even more quickly. Although there was still a trace of childishness between her eyebrows, she had become very agile. It was rare to see her like this. The reason was because of Sang Sang. She did not like to see other girls being close to Ning Quebec. Mistress Jian said, I asked you to come today to discuss the right to light. The West Hill Divine Palace has requested the House of Red Sleeves to perform a dance. I wonder what the Academy thinks. Ning Ke said, it's all up to you, Aunt Jian. If you think it's okay to go, then go. If you don't want to go, then don't. Since the contract has been signed, the West Hill Divine Palace can't do anything about it. Mistress Jian looked at him and said thoughtfully, the right to light is the grandest festival recorded in the West Hill scriptures. It is said that it will only be held when Hao Yin descends a miracle. What I don't understand is why the West Hill Divine Palace wants to hold the right to light. If it is to celebrate the victory of the war, they will only become the laughingstock of the world. Ning Ke thought for a while and asked, then what do you mean? Mistress Jian said, it's okay to go and have a look. Maybe I can help you. Ning Ke said, I'm just worried that the journey will not be peaceful. Mistress Jian looked at his eyes and asked, can you guarantee their safety? Ning Ke said after a moment of silence, even if I can't, I think someone else can. Dewdrop and Xiao Chao clearly heard the conversation between Ning Ke and Mistress Jian, but they were depressed that they did not understand what they were talking about. Someone could? Who could it be? Ning Ke left the House of Red Sleeves in a black horse carriage. Not far from the street corner, the curtain of the carriage moved slightly, and Chu Yuxian got into the carriage. He took out several big envelopes from his arms and arranged them in the dim light in the carriage. He said in a low voice, until now, the great divine priest of revelation is still vacant. There is no clue about who is most likely to take over. In this war, the Divine Hall spies in the South School of Haoyin Taoism and the Tang Empire spies in the Divine Hall played a very important role. Hundreds of spies in the Divine Hall of Tang launched an attack at the same time and assassinated several Divine Talisman Masters at the cost of their lives. But there were still many spies in the Divine Hall. From the beginning of the peace talks in early spring, those hiding in the Peach Mountain began to send back all kinds of news through the Imperial Center Administration and secret servants. Chang and City knew about the death of the great divine priest of revelation even earlier than Yi Hongyu, who was in Qinghe Prefecture at that time. Ning Ke thought of the mountain full of peach blossoms mentioned in the previous intelligence and was silent. According to the analysis of the Imperial Center Administration, Cheng Lixue should be the most likely to take over the great divine priest of revelation. But the inheritance of the great divine priest of revelation seems to be somewhat special, so his position is very awkward. If someone else really takes over the great divine priest of revelation, he is very likely to be in trouble. Chu Yuxian inherited his father's businessman qualities. Although he didn't know how to cultivate and didn't seem to have any outstanding ability, he could find the most valuable information from the reports of the Imperial Center Administration and secret guards. He looked at the file in his hand and said, the Millennium Lamp in the Divine Hall of Light did go out, but those who wanted to find out the reason all died inexplicably. So no one knew the reason. The dozen priests mentioned in the previous intelligence were confirmed to have gone crazy. Except for this, there is no other new information. Ning Ke frowned slightly and seemed a little dissatisfied. Chu Yuxian said helplessly, I have searched through the garbage in the Divine Hall, but they have all been processed. I can't find any marks, so I can't analyze them. Ning Ke asked, the stables? Chu Yuxian shook his head and said, no. Ning Ke thought for a while and asked again, the amount of wine? If it were an ordinary intelligence officer, he might not notice the changes in the number of daily necessities in the Divine Hall. But Chu Yuxian was different. He said, a lot. Ning Ke looked a little serious and asked, are there any horses that are pregnant? The horses in the Divine Halls of West Hill were all papal cavalrymen's horses, and the male horses would definitely be castrated. So his question seemed a little strange and Chu Yuxian didn't understand. No. Chu Yuxian pinched the last big envelope with his fingers and said, there is one thing that is strange. Our people in the Divine Hall once saw a pot of leftover porridge in the stables. Thinking of what you mentioned, he collected the leftover porridge in the pot. Ning Ke took the envelope and poured out the leftover porridge. The sour smell immediately filled the carriage. Chu Yuxian couldn't help but frown and cover his nose. Ning Ke looked very serious at this time, as if he didn't smell the unpleasant smell at all. He carefully poked the stinky porridge with the tip of a knife and finally found a black mane. Idiot, thank you for your hard work. He looked at the black mane and said silently in his heart. The black carriage arrived at Yanming Lake. Chu Yuxian got off the carriage and disappeared in the street in the darkness. Ning Ke got off the carriage and stood in front of the courtyard in silence for a moment. Then he said to Wang Jinglu, "Get ready. We may have to go on a long journey." Wang Jinglu took off his straw hat, put away the reins and said, "Have you really made up your mind? You know, this time it is not 10 miles outside the city, but thousands of miles of dangerous land." Ning Ke said, "I have to see it anyway. I'd rather see it myself than let others see it." Yanming Lake under the night sky reflected the dozens of lights in the house. It was like the night sky today. The bright moon had taken away too much of the brilliance of the once starry sky, making it very lonely. Ning Ke rowed the boat casually on the lake, and the side of the boat brushed against some new green branches from time to time. The lotus had not bloomed yet, but the lotus leaves had begun to reunite. The lotus leaves were gradually blooming, but people could not be reunited. Looking at the lotuses planted by him in Sang Sang, he thought of the drunkard's words again. Every death in the world is a reunion after a long separation. He had never understood how Hao Yen could find the drunkard and the butcher in the human world. He had been investigating and got many clues, which vaguely pointed to the person he once thought was the most impossible. He looked from the green lotus to the Yanming mountain across the lake, as if he could see the wicked girl holding a black umbrella, standing in the wind and snow and singing to him. "If it is really you, why don't I feel anything? Are you no longer my natal character? You returned the carriage and the iron arrows to me, but took the big black horse and the big black umbrella. Do you really want to separate from the family?" But it was not that easy to separate from the family. "Your name is still in my household register, your address is still in the old brush pen shop, and your notes are still buried in the tomb. How about I send them to you?" The night wind in early summer blew Ning Ke's face and gave him a meaningful smile. "Since every death in the world is a reunion after a long separation, let's meet again." The next morning, the famous black carriage passed through the steam of the bun house and entered the palace under the gaze of many people and the Yulin royal guards. It never came out again. This situation lasted for a few days and caused a lot of speculation. No one knew what Ning Ke was doing in the palace, not even the ministers of the imperial court. They only knew that he did not leave Chang'an. The spies of the West Hill Divine Palace in Chang'an began to be vigilant. They paid a great price for the death of 2 maidservants in the old mansion. They finally got some information. From time to time, a dull knocking sound could be heard from the underground of the small building in the palace. Lights could still be seen in the imperial study at night. All kinds of rare materials, arranged by the Ministry of Revenue, were continuously transported into Chang'an from all counties. One evening, someone saw a strong man carrying an iron hammer into the palace. When the information was sent back to the Peach Mountain, the West Hill Divine Palace came to a shocking conclusion. The Academy was trying to modify the God-stunning array. But was it true? "It's just a problem with my cervical vertebrae. It's okay. I just need to lie down more. It's just that it affects my working schedule." Continue to ask for monthly votes and recommendation votes. 2 more chapters tomorrow. I also suggest that everyone read the good posts in the book review section. There are indeed many good articles. Thank you for your hard work. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my biggest motivation. Chapter 843. Ning Ke did not come out after entering the palace. Even Qiao Shaoshu did not know what he was doing. Therefore, when he received the invitation from the academy, he thought he would know. A handsome and cute little attendant was waiting by the mountain path. He bowed politely when he saw them and said, "Mr. Qiao, this way please." When they walked into the clouds and came out again, they were on the cliff platform at the back of the mountain of the academy. Qiao Shaoshu looked at the picturesque scenery and sighed with emotion. If His Majesty did not need him, he would definitely apply for the academy. Maybe he would have the opportunity to become a student of the 2nd floor. Now he was one of them. The Tangs who came to the back of the mountain of the academy for the first time were all nervous. Qiao Shaoshu was slightly better, but Qinshi, who came with him, could hardly control his emotions. He no longer had the feeling that he usually had. Hearing the sound of the waterfall falling into the pool, the little attendant brought them to the small courtyard. Junimo was waiting for them in the courtyard. After the 3 of them greeted each other, Junimo handed them a file and said, "The academy has made this plan. We can't see anything wrong with it, so we need your judgment." Qiao Shaoshu took the file and opened it. Qinshi was a little confused. He thought that the teachers of the academy were all extremely intelligent people and did not need his judgment. Junimo knew what he was thinking and said, "The academy has killed many people, but they usually killed when they encountered them. We have no experience in this aspect." Qinchi understood the meaning of this sentence and suddenly felt a little pressure on his shoulders. He could not help but feel a little proud. He thought that it was no wonder that second brother Chao would bring him along. Second brother Chao finished reading the file and handed it to Qinchi. Then he looked at Junimo and said with a serious expression, "What Ning Ke is doing now is also related to this plan?" Junimo said, "What he is going to do is not written on the file, but it is the most important point." Qinchi looked at the file and his breathing gradually became rapid. As the brains of the Fish Dragon gang, he was no stranger to conspiracies and tricks. He had set up many traps in his life, such as the one at the Spring Breeze Pavilion that rainy night. However, he had never thought that he would have the opportunity to participate in such a plan. It should be known that those two targets were no different from immortals to him in the past. The plan in the dossier was initially conceived by Fan Yu and Ning Ke, the fourth brother of the academy, and then drafted by eldest brother himself. There was no problem with the plan if it was only based on theory and logic. However, the academy lacked experience in this area, so they had to rely on the Fish Dragon gang. Qinchi held the file tightly and read it for a long time. He forcibly suppressed his excitement and nervousness, and his brain worked quickly. After a long time he finally raised his head. "This setup is very good. I just need to modify some of the details. Give me one night and I'll be able to complete it. I believe that even if those two are immortals, they won't be able to tell." He looked at Junimo and said, "But the most crucial problem is where can we find a suitable executor? Those who dare to do it must be extraordinary. Ordinary people don't have the guts." Junimo said, "I heard that on the day the Abbey Dean entered Chang, and there were thousands of people who were hot-blooded and stood in front of youngest brother to protect him. It's not difficult for me to find such a person. If there's no other way, I'll let the two new disciples of the academy go. They haven't officially started cultivating, so they just meet the requirements." I was also on the Vermilion Bird Avenue that day. Qinchi shook his head and said, "At that time, ordinary people relied on a moment of courage. Now they have to plan and then take action. It's completely different." Chao Xiaoshu, who had not spoken much, suddenly said, "There's another way." As soon as he said this, Junimo and Qinchi immediately understood what he meant. Qinchi made the most resolute objection without hesitation, while Junimo looked at him quietly. Chao Xiaoshu smiled and said, "It's a great pity that I couldn't enter the academy to study in this life. But these years of mingling in the streets have some benefits. I can act like a human and I can act like a ghost. Does your horse still like to eat big grain porridge?" Yang Erxi pushed the bowl of cured pig trotters across the table and motioned for Ning Ke and Wang Jinglu not to stand on ceremony. Then he picked up the wine pot and filled the bowls in front of them. Ning Ke thought of the bad porridge he saw a few days ago and said with a smile, "I don't know if it still likes it, but that silly thing hasn't forgotten about it." Yang Erxi took a bite of the pig trotters and drank half a bowl of wine. He touched his stomach and sighed with satisfaction. Then he looked at him and reminded, "The situation is not good now. Be careful on the road." Ning Ke said, "The eastern border is already peaceful, so there should be no problems in the south." Yang Erxi sneered and said, "The peace of the eastern border was fought for by us. Those bastards in Qinghe County in the south have never been beaten up. How can they be so obedient?" Ning Ke raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "I remember you said 2 years ago that you had already retired." Yang Erxi patted his oily chest and said proudly, "You can't tell, can you? I joined the volunteer army and was the best at painting in the county. I was also good at fighting." Looking at this farmer that could be seen everywhere in the countryside of the Tang Empire, he did not know what to say. After Wang Jinglu entered the courtyard, he had been engrossed in eating meat and drinking wine. He did not understand how Ning Ke knew such a farmer and why he stayed here until he heard this sentence. He raised his head and held the wine bowl in front of Yang Erxi with both hands. He said seriously, "I admire you." Yang Erxi picked up the wine bowl and clinked it with him casually. He drank the remaining wine in the bowl and said, "Compared to those dead guys, there is nothing to admire." Ning Ke only then noticed that there was a scar between his eyebrows. Yang Erxi pointed there and said with a smile, "I was really lucky. Those barbarians slashed me a few times, but none of my vital parts were hurt. The wound on my face is also hidden in my eyebrows, but it did not disfigure me." Ning Ke did not say anything more and raised the wine bowl to toast again. Yang Erxi raised the wine pot and found that it was empty. He shouted towards the window, Go to the village entrance and get another pot of wine. Oh yes, cut another pig trotter. When I was at the eastern border, I always wanted to eat the pig trotters at home. Yang Erxi looked at Ning Kai and Wang Jinglu and said emotionally, why do you think we risked our lives? Isn't it for the wife and children at home? To have delicious meat to eat. At this moment, his wife's grumbling voice came from the courtyard. All you know is to eat meat and wine every day. You treat everyone you see. Aren't you afraid of eating all the money at home? The voice was neither loud nor soft, so the people outside the courtyard could not hear it. But it was definitely heard by the two people sitting at the table eating meat. Wang Jinglu was a little uneasy, but Ning Kai did not seem to hear it at all. Yang Erxi felt very embarrassed. He slammed the table angrily and shouted, what are you talking about? Can't I eat a piece of meat and drink a bowl of wine when I get home? Do you not want me to come back? The courtyard suddenly became quiet, and then the sound of a woman crying could be heard. Yang Erxi felt even more embarrassed and shouted, crying, crying, crying. You only know how to cry. You cry when I'm not at home and you still cry when you come back. I risked my life at the eastern border and earned 200 taels of silver. Can't I eat a few meals of meat? Also, if you dare to pick meat from my bowl for my son at night, I will beat you up. The woman's crying stopped. She began to chop the pig trotters, scolding the heartless man as she chopped. Ning Kai looked at him and asked carefully, really? Yang Erxi said, she's a woman. If I don't beat her up, how can she be obedient? Ning Kai asked, aren't you afraid that she will go to the county government to report you? Yang Erxi looked a little embarrassed and said, momentum, this is momentum, do you understand? Ning Kai thought about the purpose of this trip to West Hill and felt that he had learned something. After eating and drinking, it was time to say goodbye. Yang Erxi sent them to the mill and said, I don't know who you are, but I think you are not an ordinary person. I don't know what you are going to do. If you are going to kill people, kill a few more for me. If he had not drunk too much, Yang Erxi would never have said this. Ning Kai asked with a smile, how did you know? Yang Erxi said, we only met once 2 years ago. If it were not for the black horse that drank up my bowl of porridge, I would have forgotten about you. How can an ordinary person afford to raise a horse like that? Ning Kai asked, how did you know that we are going to kill people? Yang Erxi said, you are Tangs? Ning Kai said, and? Yang Erxi said matter-of-factly, if we Tangs go to Qinghe at this time, what else can we do but kill people? At this moment, a pair of siblings ran over from the other side of the road. Yang Erxi squatted down and picked them up. He looked at Ning Kai and said proudly, my daughter, my son. What do you think? Not bad, right? The top few in the school. Ning Kai said, I don't have children. What are you so proud of? Yang Erxi said, have you married? Ning Kai nodded and said, yes, you have met her. Yang Erxi said, the little girl who likes to drink? Ning Kai said with a smile, she probably doesn't like to drink anymore. Yang Erxi said, it has been 3 years. Why hasn't there been any news? Ning Kai said, I have no problems. I think she has some problems. Yang Erxi said unhappily, I don't like to hear this. You are a man. How can you push everything to a woman? If you have problems, try to solve them. Don't complain. Ning Kai said seriously, that's what I plan to do. The daughter in Yang Erxi's arms looked at the two strangers and asked curiously, Father, who are they? They are my friends from Chang'an. Yang Erxi said proudly, meaning that her father did have friends from Chang'an. He didn't lie to her before. The daughter looked at Ning Kai and rolled her eyes. She asked, where are you going? Ning Kai said, I am going to the south. The daughter asked curiously, what are you going to do in the south? Ning Kai said with a smile, to pick up my wife. The daughter said happily, is the bride beautiful? Ning Kai thought for a while and said, not really. The daughter said seriously, even if she is not beautiful, you can't abandon her. Ning Kai looked at her and said seriously, of course. Yang Erxi has begun his journey to pick up his wife. If you have any impression of the last part of the dialogue, you should remember the chapter in the first volume, the dialogue between Yang Erxi and his children. Is Nightfall my favorite? Every time I write about Yang Erxi's family, I can't help but feel happy. Deep down I still like local literature. It's been 10 years since the incident in Yingxiu. It's been 10 years. Oh. In addition, after being reminded by Xiao Xiao, he realized that the 8th chapter was about the bias of a calm mind. At that time he had been thinking of asking Ning Kai to calm his mind, but after thinking about it, he decided to change it. This was not a problem of upbringing, please understand. Then, I really wanted to crazily write 300,000 this month, but I'm really getting old. It looks like there's no hope. I'll try my best to write more and better. I'll write 1 chapter today, 2 chapters tomorrow, and 3 chapters the day after. I won't slack off. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation. Chapter 844. The summer in the southern wilderness of the Tang Empire was not hot. It was as gentle as the Empress, who was also called summer. It was very comfortable. Along the way to the south, Ning Ke naturally thought of the trip to the Lank Temple with Sang Sang. It was here that he fell in love with this place. He and Wang Jinglu rode in an ordinary carriage. When they reached the verdant canyon, they could not go any further. They abandoned the carriage and walked on foot, struggling to find a path among the rocks. There were many Tang soldiers reinforcing guard posts in the steep canyon. The imperial court did not intend to completely seal the verdant canyon. Naturally, they wanted to recover the Qinghe River one day. Walking out of the verdant canyon, they saw weeds growing in the wilderness. Even the mature cultivated land had been abandoned. Brown bloodstains could be seen in the fields, as if they would bleed with a casual step. Ning Ke seemed to see the late autumn of last year, when his senior brothers and sisters stood here facing hundreds of thousands of troops. He seemed to see second brother fighting with the world with an iron sword. He felt the pressure on his shoulders heavier. It was late. The two rested in the open air in the wilderness in front of the verdant canyon. The insects were chirping in the summer night, and the bright moon rose from the mountains. Ning Ke was speechless as he looked at the moon. When they woke up the next morning, he and Wang Jinglu continued to the south. What they saw was no different from previous years. The small bridge, the flowing water, the white walls, the black eaves, and the famous gardens along the Fuchin River were all beautiful. There were no traces of war in Yangzhou City. The bluestone streets were as clean as if they had been washed. There were no bloodstains. Vendors called out to their customers in a soft local accent, and the unique aroma of pickled duck filled the restaurants. If it were not for the well-equipped warlords patrolling the streets, it would be impossible to imagine that so many people had died and so many murders had occurred in this city a few months ago. Ning Ke and Wang Jinglu walked to the back garden of the mayor's mansion. He looked at the green bamboos sticking out of the wall in silence. There were spots on the bamboos that looked like tear stains or blood stains. On that day, the city defense mansion gathered the West Hill Divine Palace Coalition Army as an order and gathered the officials of Yangzhou in the mansion. Then they suddenly turned hostile and asked these officials to surrender. After they refused, they started a bloodbath. A total of 13 imperial court officials were killed, and 3 of them were even descendants of the warlords. Wang Jinglu looked at the city guard mansion and said in a low voice, "The person in charge of this matter is called Zhong Dejun." At that time he was the commander of the city guard mansion. He was the son of the city guard. The warlords invited the admiral of the navy to Fuchin River for a discussion and set up an ambush. After a bitter battle, the admiral of the navy and the senior officers died in battle. Then the purge and massacre of the navy on the Great Lake began. In the evening, the armed forces of the Chui clan forced their way into the governor's mansion of Qinghe County. The governor committed suicide. In just a few simple sentences, he had clearly described the major incident on the day of the rebellion in Qinghe County. On that bloody day, 3,000 Tang Navy officers and soldiers were either dead or injured, and more than 300 court officials who were loyal to the Tang Empire were beheaded. As Wang Jinglu had said earlier, there were actually many descendants of the warlords among these officials. It was just that they did not agree with the opinions of the elders in the warlords, so they became sacrifices. No matter how clean the bluestone streets in Yangzhou City were, to the point where not a single trace of blood could be seen or the smell of blood could be smelled, the blood had still flowed out and seeped into the soil between the bluestone cracks. It was not that it could not be seen or smelled, but that it had not existed. Since it had existed, it should be remembered. Ning Ke did not say anything and left the city guard mansion with Wang Jinglu. Instead of going to the inn, they went straight out of the city to the banks of the Fuchin River. They rented a boat with a black awning for 5 taels of silver and went downstream. It had not been long since the end of the war. The temporary peace in Qinghe County did not allow people to truly feel relaxed. At least, it was difficult for tourists to relax, so there were not many boats on the beautiful Fuchin River. Ning Ke and Wang Jinglu sat on both sides of the black awning boat and looked at the scenery by the river. Even though they were both experienced and knowledgeable, they had to admit that in terms of exquisite beauty, there was no place in the world that could beat this place. The black awning boat swayed leisurely as it sailed past the famous gardens by the river. The boatman explained the historical origins of the famous gardens from time to time, and the private property of the green bamboo at the foot of Crouching Tiger Mountain. He was very familiar with these things. Wang Jinglu was not in the mood to listen to these things, but Ning Kai listened very carefully. The Fuchin River was extremely beautiful, but unfortunately it was not long. The black awning boat moved slowly, swaying and swaying until it reached the downstream. It went ashore through the forest and arrived at the coal mountain of Qinghe County. The warlords of Qinghe County were known for being literate, but they did not lack the support of military and economic power. The coal mountain, which stretched for hundreds of miles, was the treasure that Haotian had given to the warlords. Wang Jinglu looked at the bottom of the pit, which was illuminated by the dim light, and his face became abnormally pale. Ning Kai's expression did not change. He squatted down and used his hand to touch the leg bone of a rotten corpse. After confirming that it had been smashed by a heavy object, he walked inside and looked at the injuries on the corpses. There were at least hundreds of corpses at the bottom of the coal pit. These corpses were so badly rotten that there was no sign of their identity. However, he knew that these were the people he was looking for. These people did not die of knife wounds or arrow wounds. They died of starvation, thirst, or exhaustion. These people had been brave Tang soldiers when they were alive. Of course, they had resisted before being tortured. That was why the whips had taken away the flesh on the bones, and why the leg bones had been broken by the stones. Ning Kai and Wang Jinglu stood in front of the corpses of the Tang soldiers and were silent for a long time. The Tang Empire had always given the highest respect to the soldiers who fought for the country. Even a corpse would not be allowed to wander outside, let alone the Tang soldiers who had been alive at that time. Ever since they knew that more than 1,000 of the Tang Navy had been sent to the coal mountain by the warlords of Qinghe County, the imperial court of the Tang Empire had never stopped trying to save them. Even at the critical moment when the Abbey Dean entered Chang'an, the imperial court did not forget to send a warning to Qinghe County and secretly promised to give them corresponding benefits as long as they could release these people. It was believed that after this, the warlords of Qinghe County would be very clear about Chang'an's attitude and would not dare to torture these Tang soldiers anymore. However, in less than a month before this, hundreds of these Tang soldiers had died at the coal mountain. One could imagine what kind of torture and pain they had suffered at that time. Wang Jinglu used to be a minister of offerings in the prince's mansion and lived a carefree life. Later, he was sent by His Majesty to serve under General Su Shi. After several years of training, he had long become a real soldier. Looking at the hundreds of corpses at the bottom of the pit, he said, "We have to find a way to send them back." Ning Kai had been in the army in the city of Wei for many years and knew the customs of the army. However, he did not agree with Wang Jinglu and said, "It's not a problem to be buried here, but we need to build a better tomb." Wang Jinglu understood what he meant. One day, the Tang Empire's cavalry would rush out of the Verdant Canyon and sweep across the south of the human world. Qinghe County was and would be the territory of the Tang Empire in the future. Ning Kai said, "When I slaughtered the Qinghe County Guild Hall in Chang'an, some people always thought that I was too ruthless and worried that it would affect the hearts of the people of Qinghe. If they saw this scene, I don't know if they would still insist on their views. We can take our time to build the hearts of the people, but the dead people will urge us to move faster." Wang Jinglu said, "There are still many people in Qinghe County who are loyal to the Tang Empire. Even many of the descendants of the warlords still consider themselves Tangs. Otherwise, there would not have been so many descendants and officials who died during the rebellion. I'm just worried that if we kill too many of them, it will push them to the opposite side." When the warlords rebelled, those people did not stand up to express their opinions. When more than 300 Tang officials were beheaded, they still stood by and watched silently. I don't know where their hearts are, but I only know that they were once silent. That means they are accomplices, and that they have a reason to die. Ning Kai said, "My hands are stained with a lot of blood and no matter how I wash them, I can't wash them clean. Some people seem to have no blood on their hands, but even if they jump into the Fuchin River, they won't be able to wash them clean. Try to finish the next chapter before 1 o'clock. To be continued. If you like this work, please come to Chidian.com to vote for me. Your support is my greatest motivation." You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.